When ruthless bandits targeted the isolated Willow Creek Ranch, they made the fatal mistake of threatening Rebecca Mitchell. They had no idea the quiet young widow was once the military's most legendary tracker whose impossible hunts had earned the call sign Artemis. They came for her land. They'll leave in body bags. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late September sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek. As Rebecca Mitchell guided her dappled grey mare along the winding path toward home, russet and gold leaves spiraled down around her, creating a carpet of autumn colors beneath her horse's hooves. The crisp mountain air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke as she returned from her weekly supply run to the small town of Clearwater Springs. 3 years had passed since Rebecca buried her husband Michael beside the aspen grove that crowned their Montana property. 3 years since she'd left behind her military career to run this cattle ranch alone. 3 years, rebuilding a life that felt whole again, if not complete. The locals knew her only as the reserved young widow who raised premium beef cattle and occasionally taught wilderness survival to the local 4-H kids. They didn't know about the woman who had once tracked high-value targets across 3 continents, whose uncanny ability to read terrain and predict human movement had made her the most sought-after asset in special operations. The mare's ears pricked forward as they approached Johnson's general store, alerting Rebecca to movement before she consciously registered it. Old habits die hard. Her posture shifted imperceptibly, weight balanced, senses heightening. Wade Johnson emerged onto the weathered porch, stacking pumpkins for his seasonal display. The store owner's lined face carried an expression Rebecca recognized immediately. Controlled concern. "Heard about the newcomers?" Wade asked quietly when she was within earshot, his eyes scanning the quiet street before returning to her. Rebecca tied her mare to the hitching post, keeping her expression neutral. "What newcomers?" As a former ranger who'd served 2 tours before settling in Clearwater Springs, Wade was one of the few who knew fragments of Rebecca's past. Not everything, no one knew everything, but enough to understand when trouble might be brewing. "Group of rough types have been staying at the old Miller place for the past week," Wade said, voice low. "Been asking questions about water rights and property boundaries. Got Sheriff Lawson looking mighty uncomfortable." Rebecca adjusted her worn leather jacket, concealing the slight tension that rippled through her shoulders. "Long as they keep to themselves, Wade, it's not our concern." She gathered the supplies she needed, feed supplements for the pregnant heifers, coffee, and the specific brand of bourbon she allowed herself on Friday evenings, trying to ignore the familiar prickle climbing her spine. 3 years ago, she'd promised herself she was done with that world, done with the life that had earned her the designation Artemis among military circles. Her tracking kit, once used to hunt the most dangerous men in the world, now served a peaceful purpose, finding lost livestock and occasionally helping Sheriff Lawson locate hikers who wandered off trail in the surrounding wilderness. The metallic jingle of spurs on the wooden sidewalk caught Rebecca's attention. 2 men she didn't recognize sauntered toward the general store, their movements carrying the distinctive swagger of those accustomed to intimidation. Their clothes were expensive but trail-worn, their boots bearing the dust of long travel. One wore a revolver in a tooled leather holster, making no attempt to conceal it. "They've been coming in every day around this time," Wade murmured, rearranging his pumpkin display with deliberate care. "Buying supplies, asking questions." Rebecca nodded, almost imperceptibly, loading her purchases into her saddlebags. The taller of the 2 strangers met her gaze as they approached, his eyes lingering a beat too long. She recognized the assessment in that look, the cold calculation of a predator sizing up potential prey. It was a look she'd seen in the eyes of warlords and cartel leaders, never in Clearwater Springs. "Afternoon, ma'am," the man said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. His companion remained silent, eyes scanning the street behind her. Rebecca acknowledged him with the barest nod, nothing in her posture betraying the fact that she'd already catalogued 7 distinct details about him. The slight asymmetry in his gait, suggesting an old injury to his right knee, the calluses on his hands inconsistent with ranch work, the subtle bulge of a secondary weapon at his ankle, and the communication device partially concealed by his jacket collar. "Beautiful country around here," he continued when she didn't respond. Further, "Your place nearby?" "Just passing through," Rebecca lied smoothly, adjusting her hat to better shade her eyes. "Heading north to visit family." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That so?" Though Johnson here was loading up your regular order, Wade tensed beside her, but Rebecca's expression remained impassive. "Mr. Johnson is kind enough to hold packages for several families in the area. Good day, gentlemen." She mounted her mare. In one fluid motion, a movement practiced thousands of times that concealed the coiled readiness in her muscles. As she rode away, she could feel their eyes tracking her movement down the street. Rebecca took the long way home, weaving through a series of game trails that would make it impossible for anyone to follow without extensive tracking experience. Old habits from her former life that had never quite faded. Once certain she wasn't being followed, she allowed herself to consider the implications of the stranger's presence in Clearwater Springs. The peaceful life she'd built for herself felt suddenly precarious, like a house of cards in a rising wind. 3 years of careful anonymity threatened by men whose purpose she didn't yet understand, but whose nature she recognized all too well. The ranch came into view as she created the final rigid 600 acres of prime Montana grazing land nestled in a valley bordered by pine forest and the crystal waters of Willow Creek. It wasn't the largest spread in the county, but its strategic location controlling access to the upper watershed made it valuable beyond its acreage. Michael had fallen in love with the property instantly when they'd first visited, already planning improvements before they'd even made an offer. A former Army medic who'd served in the same unit as Rebecca for 2 tours, he'd dreamed of raising cattle and children in this peaceful valley. The cancer took him just 8 months after they'd moved in, before either dream could fully materialize. Rebecca guided her mare toward the barn, where her ranch hand Billy Hawkins was already finishing the evening feed. At 19, Billy was the youngest son of a neighboring rancher, working part-time while taking agricultural courses at the community college in Bozeman. He knew Rebecca only as a capable rancher who'd taught him more about animal husbandry in 6 months than he'd learned in years on his father's place. "Everything all right, Mrs. Mitchell?" Billy asked, reading the subtle tension in her posture as she dismounted. Another reminder that she wasn't the only observant one on the ranch. "Fine, Billy. Just a long ride," she replied, unloading her saddlebags. "How's that pregnant heifer doing?" "Restless. Doc Sanders says probably another week before she calves." Rebecca nodded, appreciating his thoroughness. "You should head home before dark. Looks like we might get that storm they've been predicting." After Billy departed, Rebecca secured the barn and walked the short distance to the main house, a 2-story structure of weathered cedar and stone that Michael had painstakingly renovated before his illness took hold. Inside, she moved directly to the gun safe concealed behind a false panel in the mudroom, entering the combination with practiced ease. The Winchester rifle she used for predator control was a practical ranching tool that raised no eyebrows in Montana. The custom Remington 700 with advanced optics she now withdrew was something else entirely. A precision instrument she'd hoped never to need again. Rebecca checked the weapon with efficient movements, her muscle memory flawless despite 3 years of disuse. Satisfied, she returned it to the safe, but left the combination unlocked, another old habit resurfacing. In the kitchen, she prepared a simple meal while her mind worked through contingencies. The strangers in town could be simple land speculators looking to buy up property, or they could be connected to Westridge Resources, the mining company that had been pressuring ranchers to sell water rights throughout the county, or they could be something else entirely. Rebecca sat at the kitchen table, county maps spread before her as she ate. Her property's strategic value wasn't lost on her. Willow Creek Ranch controlled the only viable access road to the Upper Valley, where satellite imagery had recently revealed significant mineral deposits. The surrounding national forest land made coming in from other directions nearly impossible without federal permits. A soft electronic tone from the security system alerted her to movement at the property's main gate. Rebecca moved to the monitor, mounted discreetly beside the refrigerator, watching as a county sheriff's vehicle pulled up to the entrance. She recognized Sheriff Lawson's silhouette immediately, his cowboy hat and broad shoulders unmistakable even in the fading light. She disarmed the gate remotely, allowing him to drive through, then stepped onto the porch to meet him. Tom Lawson had been sheriff of Jefferson County for 15 years. A former Marine who'd returned home to serve the community where he'd grown up. He'd been a friend to Michael, helping with ranch repairs during the worst of his illness. Evening. "Rebecca," he called, climbing out of his cruiser. "Hope I'm not interrupting your dinner." "Just finished," she replied, noting the unusual tension in his normally relaxed demeanor. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some." Inside, she poured 2 mugs and set one before him at the kitchen table. Lawson removed his hat, revealing receding salt and pepper hair, and settled into a chair with a heaviness that spoke of a long day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I expect you've noticed we've got some new folks in town," he began, wrapping weathered hands around the steaming mug. Rebecca nodded. "Wade mentioned them. Said they're staying at the old Miller place." "That's right." Lawson took a sip of coffee. "They claim they represent some investors looking at developing recreational property in the county. Been asking a lot of questions about water rights, easements, who owns what. And you don't believe them," Rebecca stated, reading between the lines. The sheriff's eyes met hers. "Let's just say their background checks don't match their story. 2 of them have sealed records I can't access, and their supposed development company doesn't exist in any database I can find." Rebecca considered this information, feeling the familiar mental shift that had once helped her track targets across mountains and deserts. "They approached you officially?" "Came by the office 3 days ago. Man named Vance Blackwood does most of the talking. Smooth-type corporate manner, but his associates—" Lawson shook his head. "They don't move like businessmen, Rebecca. They move like operators," she finished for him. Lawson nodded grimly. "I've called in some favors, trying to get more information. In the meantime, I'm making rounds to all the isolated properties, letting folks know to stay alert." He hesitated. "These men, they were asking specifically about in properties along Willow Creek. Yours came up. The implications settled between them like a physical presence. Rebecca's ranch wasn't just any property, it was the strategic keystone to accessing the entire upper watershed." "I appreciate the warning, Tom," she said evenly. Lawson studied her face. "I know you can handle yourself, Rebecca. Michael always said you were the toughest soldier he'd ever served with, but even so—" He reached into his jacket and withdrew. "A satellite phone. Cell service out here is spotty at best. Keep this with you. 1 button connects directly to my office." Rebecca accepted the phone, recognizing it as higher-grade equipment than standard county issue. Lawson had indeed called in favors. "There's something else you should know," the sheriff added, reluctance evident in his voice. "They asked about you specifically, about the widow who runs Willow Creek Ranch alone. Seemed particularly interested in your background." A cold certainty settled in Rebecca's stomach. This wasn't random. These men weren't simply land speculators or mining company representatives. They were looking for her. The question was whether they knew who they were truly hunting. After Lawson departed with promises to increase patrols past her property, Rebecca secured the house and retreated to her office, a small room off the main hallway that had once been planned as a nursery. Now it contained a desk, filing cabinets, and ranch records. Behind the largest cabinet, accessible only when it was pulled away from the wall, was a hidden compartment. Rebecca hadn't opened it in 3 years. Not since the day after Michael's funeral, when she'd sealed away that part of her life. The compartment contained what remained of Artemis, specialized gear, documentation, and the secure communication devices that could still connect her to former colleagues if absolute necessity demanded it. She had hoped never to need these things again, but she hadn't destroyed them. Some instincts ran too deep. From a concealed drawer, she withdrew a topographical map of the surrounding 50 square miles, far more detailed than anything commercially available. Every ridge, ravine, and game trail was marked with precision, along with natural choke points and potential observation posts. She had created it during her first month on the ranch, another habit she couldn't break. If trouble was coming, she needed to be prepared. Not just to defend, but to control the ground on which any confrontation would occur. As night settled over Willow Creek Ranch, Rebecca Mitchell moved through her property with purpose, checking security measures and mentally cataloging every advantage the terrain offered. To an observer, she might have appeared to be simply a cautious widow securing her home. But with each step, with each assessment, Artemis was awakening. The predator these men sought had been dormant, not dead, and they had made their first mistake by hunting her on her own territory. Morning broke over Willow Creek Ranch with the crisp clarity unique to Montana autumns. Rebecca was already awake, having slept lightly, rising before dawn to check on the pregnant heifer. The animal had delivered. A healthy calf, sometime in the early hours, new life appearing just as Rebecca sensed danger approaching. She watched the newborn wobble to its feet, instinct driving it to seek nourishment from its mother. Nature's perfect cycle continues regardless of human concerns. After ensuring both animals were healthy, Rebecca secured the barn and headed toward the ridge overlooking her property. The vantage point offered a clear view of the valley below, her ranch house, outbuildings, and the winding dirt road that served as the only official access to her land. Beyond that lay Clearwater Springs, just visible as a cluster of buildings in the distance, and farther still, the main highway cutting through Jefferson County like a man-made river. Through her binoculars, Rebecca spotted a convoy of 3 vehicles. Turning off the highway toward Clearwater Springs, 2 black SUVs bracketing a heavy-duty pickup with a camper shell. They moved with purpose, maintaining even spacing that spoke of coordination rather than coincidence, not local traffic, not tourists exploring the autumn colors. Rebecca's jaw tightened. The vehicles matched Sheriff Lawson's description of those, belonging to the men staying at the Miller place. She descended the ridge using a game trail that kept her movements concealed from the valley below, her footsteps practically silent despite the carpet of fallen leaves. Years of tracking in combat zones had taught her to move like a ghost, a skill that had saved her life countless times and now seemed poised to be necessary once again. At the house, Rebecca changed into riding clothes and placed a call to Billy, telling him not to come in today. The fewer people at the ranch, the better. She saddled her mare and packed saddlebags with essentials, water, field rations that remained from her military days, first aid supplies, and the satellite phone Lawson had provided. In her jacket pocket, she placed a small tracking device with a range of 5 miles, another remnant of her former life that she'd kept operational. The Winchester rifle slid into its scabbard on the saddle. The Remington, disassembled and wrapped, in oilcloth went into a specially designed compartment in the saddlebag. To any observer, she would appear to be a rancher, heading out to check fence lines or look for strays, a common enough sight in cattle country. Rebecca rode east, away from town, following the creek that gave her ranch its name. Her plan was simple but effective: circle wide around Clearwater Springs, approach from an unexpected direction, and gather intelligence on the strangers without being spotted. Assessment before action, the first rule of her training. 2 hours later, she left her mare concealed in a stand of aspens with water and feed, continuing on foot toward the old Miller homestead, where the strangers had established their base. The property lay abandoned for years after the elderly Miller couple passed away, their children showing no interest in maintaining the remote Montana residence. Located 3 miles outside town limits, it offered privacy and multiple access routes, an ideal staging area for whatever operation these men were conducting. Rebecca approached from downwind, using a dry creek bed that provided cover while allowing rapid movement. Each step was placed with deliberate care, her senses fully engaged in reading the terrain. Fresh tire tracks cut across an old logging road, multiple vehicles recently used. Cigarette butts had been carelessly discarded near a fallen log that offered a clear view of the main road, a lookout position. She collected one, noting the foreign brand uncommon in rural Montana. As she neared the property, Rebecca slowed her pace, moving with increasing caution. The Miller place consisted of a modest 2-story farmhouse, a large barn, and several outbuildings spread across 20 acres of overgrown fields. From her concealed position among the tall grass at the property's edge, she counted 4 vehicles, the 3 she'd spotted earlier, plus a dirt-spattered motorcycle partially hidden behind the barn. Activity around the building suggested at least 6 men, professionally trained, judging by their movement patterns and the systematic way they'd established a security perimeter. 2 regularly patrolled the property boundaries, while others remained inside or near the vehicles. Their weapons weren't prominently displayed, but the telltale bulges beneath jackets and the rifle case one carried from an SUV to the house told her everything she needed to know. These weren't corporate representatives or land developers. Their bearing, their vigilance, their spacing all screamed military or paramilitary background. A tall man emerged from the house, his bearing marking him as the leader. Even at this distance, Rebecca recognized him as the stranger who'd spoken to her outside Johnson's store, Vance Blackwood, according to Lawson. He gestured toward a laptop set up on a folding table on the porch, calling another man over to view something on the screen. Rebecca wished for her field scope, left behind in the hidden compartment at the ranch. Without it, she couldn't read their lips or see the laptop's display. Still, body language told her plenty. Blackwood was agitated, stabbing his finger repeatedly at something on the screen, while the other man nodded grimly. She'd seen enough for an initial assessment. These men were planning something significant involving her property, and they had the resources and training to be dangerous. It was time to gather more specific intelligence. Rebecca retreated as carefully as she'd approached, leaving no sign of her presence. Once back with her mare, she rode toward town, approaching Clearwater Springs from the north to maintain her cover story of having been checking fence lines. The main street of Clearwater Springs embodied classic small-town Montana, a modest collection of storefronts, a diner, Johnson's General Store, the sheriff's office, and assorted businesses serving the local ranching community. Rebecca tied her horse outside the diner, removing her hat briefly to run fingers through wind-tangled hair before replacing it low over her eyes. Inside, the lunch crowd provided perfect cover. She chose a booth with a clear view of both the doctor and the street outside, ordering coffee and the daily special from a waitress who greeted her by name. In communities this small, anonymity was impossible, so Rebecca had long ago embraced selective visibility, appearing regularly enough To avoid suspicion, while remaining forgettably unremarkable, she was halfway through her meal when the bell above the door jingled. Two men entered. One she recognized from the Miller property, the other unfamiliar, but carrying the same dangerous competence in his movements. They took a table near the window, positioning themselves to observe both the street and the diners. Interior. Rebecca kept her attention on her food, careful not to make direct eye contact, while keeping them in her peripheral vision. The waitress approached their table with menus, and Rebecca focused on their conversation, her exceptional hearing, honed by years of surveillance work, allowing her to catch fragments despite the diner's ambient noise. A meeting confirmed. If for tomorrow, Mitchell woman problem if she won't. Blackwood says we proceed either way. The mention of her name sent a cold ripple down Rebecca's spine, confirming her property was indeed their target. She finished her meal unhurriedly, paid in cash, and left a generous tip, actions of a regular patron with nothing to hide. Outside, Rebecca crossed the street to Johnson's store, ostensibly to pick up a few items forgotten during yesterday's supply run. Wade was helping an elderly customer when she entered, but caught her eye with a subtle nod toward the back of the store. After selecting some canned goods and ammunition for the Winchester, legitimate purchases for any rancher, Rebecca made her way to the counter. Wade rang up her purchases, speaking quietly as he bagged them. "Those fellows have been asking specific questions about your water rights," he murmured. "One came in this morning with survey maps of the upper watershed. Your property was marked." "Anything else?" Rebecca asked, counting out bills. "They've been making calls from the satellite phone at Miller Place. Sheriff's deputy noticed the signal. Military-grade equipment, not standard commercial." Rebecca nodded slightly, absorbing this information. "Anyone approach you directly about my background?" Wade's hands stilled momentarily. "Man in a suit, not one of the rough ones, asked if you'd lived here long, if you were really running that ranch alone. Seemed mighty interested in how you handle security out there, being a woman by yourself." "What did you tell him?" A ghost of a smile touched Wade's weathered face. "Told him Rebecca Mitchell can handle herself just fine, and folks around here learned quickly to respect her privacy." Rebecca allowed herself a small smile in return. "Thanks, Wade." As she stepped back onto the sidewalk, Rebecca noticed Sheriff Lawson's cruiser parked outside his office across the street. She crossed over, leading her mare by the reins. Lawson was at his desk, reading through paperwork, with a furrowed brow that deepened when she entered. He rose immediately, ushering her into his private office and closing the door. "Got some information," he said without preamble. "Those background checks finally came through. Vance Blackwood worked for a private military contractor until 3 years ago when the company dissolved following allegations of human rights violations in South America. Several of his associates have similar backgrounds." Rebecca absorbed this, pieces clicking into place. "They're mercenaries." "Seems so." Lawson ran a hand through his thinning hair. "What doesn't make sense is why they'd be interested in a cattle ranch in Montana, even one with valuable water rights." Rebecca considered whether to share her suspicions. Lawson was trustworthy, but knowing too much could put him in danger. Still, she needed allies. "It might not be about the water rights at all," she said carefully. "Have you considered they might be looking for me specifically?" Lawson's eyes narrowed. "Because of Michael's military connections?" Rebecca chose her next words with precision. "Michael wasn't the only one with a service record, Tom." Understanding dawned on the sheriff's face. "You weren't just any soldier." "No," she confirmed quietly. "I wasn't." Before she could elaborate, dispatch radioed Lawson about a disturbance at the edge of town. He responded briefly before turning. "Back to Rebecca. We'll continue this conversation. In the meantime, I've deputized some reliable locals to increase patrols. Nobody's getting to your place without us knowing about it." Rebecca appreciated the gesture but knew it wouldn't be enough against men like Blackwood. "I'll be ready either way." Outside, Rebecca mounted her mare and headed toward home, taking the main road this time, making herself visible. If Blackwood's men were watching, and she was certain they were, let them see her returning openly to her ranch. Let them think she remained unaware of their presence at the Miller property, of their interest in her specifically. Let them underestimate her. As she rode, Rebecca's mind worked methodically through scenarios and contingencies. Blackwood's operation was well-funded and professional. The question was whether they knew exactly who they were dealing with, whether they'd connected rancher Rebecca Mitchell to operative Artemis, or if they were simply investigating her as Michael Mitchell's widow. The distinction would determine their approach and their readiness for what she could deliver if threatened. The afternoon sun was beginning its westward descent when Rebecca crested the final ridge overlooking her ranch. She reined in her mare, scanning the valley below with careful attention. Everything appeared normal, the house and outbuildings undisturbed, cattle grazing peacefully in the lower pasture. Too normal. Rebecca's instincts, honed by tracking the world's most dangerous targets across hostile territory, screamed warning. She dismounted, tethering her mare to a pine, and retrieved her binoculars. Methodically, she examined her property, searching for the discrepancies that amateurs would miss, but that announced themselves clearly to her trained eye. There, the barn door was latched differently than her standard practice. And there, a glint of metal from the upstairs window of the house, quickly withdrawn but unmistakable. Someone was inside her home. Rebecca's pulse remained steady as she assessed the situation. At least 2 intruders, possibly more, had breached her property during her absence. Whether this was a reconnaissance mission or something more sinister remained to be seen. She retrieved the disassembled Remington from her saddlebag, quickly and expertly putting the weapon together. The familiar weight in her hands awakened muscle memories from countless operations, her body remembering what her conscious mind had tried to forget. Moving with deliberate silence, Rebecca descended toward her property using a game trail that would keep her concealed from viewpoints at the house. The trail led to a dry creek bed that ran behind the barn, offering a covered approach to the rear of her property. As she neared the barn, Rebecca spotted fresh boot prints in the soft earth. Not her own, not Billy's, and certainly not from any one local who would have business on her land. Military-style boots, deep impressions suggesting a heavily equipped wearer. The barn's side door was unlatched, another departure from her strict protocols. Rebecca slipped inside, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. The animals were undisturbed, but she immediately noticed signs of intrusion. Tack moved, a storage cabinet left slightly ajar, footprints in the dust of the rarely used back stall. She checked the hidden compartment built into the feed storage area, untouched. Either the intruders hadn't found it, or they hadn't been looking for it specifically. From the barn's loft window, Rebecca had a clear view of the house. 2 men moved on the porch, unfamiliar figures carrying themselves with military bearing. A third emerged from the front door, shaking his head, reporting a search completed by his demeanor, not finding what they sought. Rebecca's jaw tightened. These men were conducting a professional search of her property, likely looking for something specific, documents, weapons, or evidence of her former identity. She needed to understand their objective before determining her response. If this was simply about water rights or mineral access, negotiation remained possible. If they were hunting Artemis, that was another matter entirely. Rebecca checked her watch. The sun would set in less than 2 hours. Darkness would provide tactical advantages, especially on terrain she knew intimately. She would wait, observe, and gather intelligence before making her next move. The minutes stretched as she maintained her hidden position, watching the intruders complete their search of her property. Their movements suggested training and experience, but also growing frustration. Whatever they sought remained elusive. As dusk approached, a vehicle appeared on the access road, one of the black SUVs from the Miller property. It stopped short of the house, and Vance Blackwood emerged, his posture radiating authority and irritation. The men Rebecca had been observing approached him with visible difference, providing what appeared to be a negative report. Blackwood's response was immediate and unmistakable: anger, followed by renewed determination. He gestured forcefully toward the surrounding landscape, then pointed at a map one of his men produced. The message was clear: expand the search. Rebecca's mind calculated rapidly. With darkness approaching, Blackwood's men would likely establish a perimeter and continue their search at first light. This gave her a narrow window to act, to gather specific intelligence about their objectives and potentially turn the tables. The pregnant clouds that had been building all afternoon finally delivered on their promise, releasing a gentle rainfall. That would help mask movement and sound. Rebecca smiled grimly. The weather had often been her ally during operations, another element that lesser trackers failed to fully utilize. As the light faded and the rain increased, she made her decision. Rather than retreating to safety, Rebecca would advance. Rather than being hunted, she would become the hunter. Blackwood and his men had made a critical error. They'd invaded her territory, disturbed her home, and initiated a confrontation without fully understanding their opponent's capabilities. They were about to discover why Artemis had been the military's most feared tracker, and why those who encountered her in her element rarely lived to speak of it. Darkness enveloped Willow Creek Ranch as the autumn storm intensified, transforming the gentle rainfall into sheets of water that obscured visibility and muffled sound. For most, such conditions would force retreat and delay. For Rebecca Mitchell, they provided the perfect cover. She moved through her property like a shadow, utilizing pathways and approaches unknown to maps or casual observation. The years she'd spent memorizing every inch of her land now served a purpose beyond ranching. They transformed the terrain into a weapon she could wield with deadly precision. From the concealment of a lightning-struck pine 30 yards from the house, Rebecca observed Blackwood's operation. 8 men total, 4 securing the perimeter, 2 remaining with Blackwood near the vehicles, and 2 continuing to search outbuildings. With methodical precision, their communication devices glinted occasionally in the dim light, confirming her suspicion of military-grade equipment. Rebecca circled behind the barn, moving through the driving rain with practiced silence. Her destination was the equipment shed, a seemingly unremarkable structure that housed tractors and ranch implements, but also contained a hidden entrance to the storm cellar Michael had reinforced during his first months on the property. The cellar connected to the main house through a tunnel, an unusual feature Michael had discovered during renovation and enhanced rather than sealed. "Always have an exit strategy," he'd said with the wisdom of a combat veteran. Rebecca had agreed, never imagining how soon such precautions would prove necessary. She slipped into the shed through a concealed access point in the rear foundation, a tight squeeze designed to be overlooked by anyone not specifically searching for it. Inside, darkness was complete, but Rebecca navigated by touch and memory, finding the trapdoor concealed beneath stacked hay bales. The storm cellar beyond was cool and dry, illuminated only by the small tactical flashlight she permitted herself. Along one wall stood metal shelving, stocked with emergency supplies, food, water, medical equipment, and ammunition. Along another wall hung topographical maps of the surrounding 50 miles, annotated with her precise handwriting. But Rebecca's destination was the heavy footlocker pushed against the far wall. She knelt before it, entering a combination on the reinforced lock. Inside lay the remnants of a life she'd left behind, or thought she had. The contents represented years of specialized training and field operations few people knew existed. A custom tactical vest with specialized pouches. Night vision equipment is more advanced than standard military issues. Communication devices capable of encrypted transmission. A field medical kit containing items restricted to military use. And, beneath it all, a sealed waterproof case containing the documentation of Operative Artemis. The identity Rebecca had assumed was buried forever. She removed the case, breaking the seal for the first time since Michael's funeral. Inside lay her service record, or at least the heavily redacted version that officially existed, multiple commendations for actions that would never be publicly acknowledged. And photographs, rare tangible evidence of a shadow career. Rebecca lifted one photo, studying it in the beam of her flashlight. 5 soldiers stood before a transport helicopter in mountainous terrain, faces grimy with dust and exhaustion, but eyes alert. 4 men and 1 woman, Rebecca herself, almost unrecognizable to those who knew only the rancher she'd become. Her finger traced the faces of her former team members. Jackson Torres, communications specialist, killed in action in the mountains of northern Afghanistan. Eric Matheson, demolitions expert, now training recruits at a base in Virginia. Carlos Menendez, field medic, whereabouts unknown after leaving service. And Michael Mitchell, tactical officer, and eventually her husband, now resting beneath the aspens on the ridge above their home. Together, they had formed Tracker Unit 7, an elite special operations team tasked with locating high-value targets in the most challenging and hostile environments on Earth. And Rebecca had been their most valuable asset, the tracker whose skills had become legendary within the small circle of those with clearance to know. She set the photo aside, withdrawing the after-action report that had changed everything. Operation Shadowfall. The mission parameters had seemed straightforward. Locate and capture Anton Zakarian, international arms dealer with ties to terrorist organizations across 3 continents. Intelligence placed him at a compound in the remote mountains of Kazakhstan. Tracker Unit 7 was deployed to find him, confirm his identity, and facilitate capture. The mission had gone catastrophically wrong. Rebecca still carried the physical and psychological scars. Faulty intelligence had led them into a trap. The unit had been ambushed, Torres killed instantly, Menendez and Michael severely wounded. Only Rebecca's uncanny tracking ability had gotten them out alive, leading the injured men through 50 miles of hostile mountain terrain while evading pursuit. Upon extraction, they'd learned the truth. Zakarian had been tipped off about the operation by someone within their own chain of command. The realization that they'd been betrayed by one of their own had been more devastating than the ambush itself. The subsequent investigation had been cursory and unsatisfying. A mid-level intelligence officer had been identified as the leak and court-martialed. But Rebecca and Michael had both sensed the truth ran deeper. Certain influential names had been conspicuously absent from the inquiry, certain questions left deliberately unasked. 2 months later, Michael had been diagnosed with aggressive cancer, a cruel twist that doctors suggested might have been triggered by chemical exposure during previous operations. 3 months after that, they'd purchased Willow Creek Ranch, determined to build a new life away from the shadows. Now, examining the documents spread before her, Rebecca wondered if the past had finally caught up to them. If Blackwood's presence was connected to Operation Shadowfall rather than simple land acquisition. She returned to the sealed case, removing a small leather-bound journal, Michael's private record of their operations, maintained against regulations but meticulous in its detail. He'd given it to her the week before his death. "If they ever come looking," he'd said, his once powerful frame diminished by illness, "this will tell you who and why. Trust no one outside the unit, Becca, not even a command." She'd honored his wishes, sealing away the journal without reading it, hoping the knowledge it contained would never be needed. Now, she turned to the entries on Operation Shadowfall, reading Michael's precise handwriting by flashlight. The details confirmed her worst fears. Michael had suspected that Zakarian's intelligence ties ran to the highest levels of certain private military contractors, including the company that records indicated had once employed Vance Blackwood. More damning still, Michael had documented communications suggesting Zakarian had survived the ambush and disappeared with a new identity, likely facilitated by these same contractors. Rebecca closed the journal, her suspicions crystallizing into certainty. Blackwood wasn't here for water rights or mineral access. He was here to eliminate the last person who could connect Zakarian to his new identity and his powerful protectors, the legendary tracker who had nearly captured him in those Kazakhstan mountains. He was hunting Artemis. The realization should have filled her with dread, but instead, Rebecca felt a strange calm descend, the familiar mental clarity that had always preceded her most challenging operations. If Blackwood wanted to find Artemis, he would succeed beyond his darkest nightmares. She changed quickly into the tactical gear from the footlocker, muscle memory guiding her movements in the dim light. The equipment felt foreign after 3 years. Of disuse yet intimately familiar, like reconnecting with a part of herself long suppressed but never truly forgotten. Properly equipped, Rebecca accessed the tunnel connecting the storm cellar to the main house. The passage was narrow and low-ceilinged, requiring her to move in a crouched position, but it would allow her to enter the house undetected by Blackwood's perimeter guards. The tunnel terminated in a concealed panel behind the pantry shelving. Rebecca paused, listening intently for movement within the house. Hearing nothing, she eased the panel open and slipped into the darkened kitchen. The intruders had searched thoroughly but with surprising discipline. Items moved and examined but returned to approximately correct positions. They were professionals, not common thieves, and they'd been looking for something specific. Rebecca moved through the house like a ghost, clearing rooms with the methodical precision of her training. The building was empty now, Blackwood's men having completed their search and withdrawn to regroup with their leader outside. From the second-floor bedroom window, she could observe the men conferring near their vehicles, their frustration evident, even through the curtain of rain. Whatever they'd hoped to find inside the house had eluded them. A sudden movement near the tree line caught her attention, a figure moving with military precision toward the group. A scout returning from the western perimeter, judging by his approach angle. The man reached Blackwood, reporting something that caused immediate tension among the group. Rebecca focused intently, reading their body language through the downpour. The scout was reporting an unexpected discovery. Blackwood's response was immediate and aggressive, orders issued rapidly, men moving with renewed purpose toward vehicles. They'd found something. But what? The answer came with sickening clarity as she caught fragments of their shouted commands through a momentary lull in the storm. Secure the North Ridge. Check the grave. Michael's grave. They were heading to Michael's grave on the Aspen Ridge. Cold rage filled Rebecca, more dangerous than any mere anger. They would desecrate her husband's resting place in their hunt for evidence. This wasn't simply about eliminating a potential witness anymore. It was about destroying everything that remained of the man she'd loved. She had to move immediately, but direct confrontation against 8 armed men would be suicide, even with her skills and knowledge of the terrain. She needed to separate them, reduce their numerical advantage, and create confusion. Rebecca returned to the storm cellar through the tunnel, retrieving additional equipment from the footlocker. The satellite phone Lawson had provided was waterproof, but too easily tracked. Instead, she activated one of her old secure communication devices, sending a burst transmission on a frequency she knew would be monitored by certain government agencies. The encrypted message was brief: Operative Artemis. Shadowfall compromised. Zakarian assets active at these coordinates. She included the location of the Miller property rather than her ranch. The transmission would create confusion and potentially draw official attention, but not quickly enough to prevent what was happening. Now, for the immediate threat, she would rely on her own capabilities. Rebecca emerged from the storm cellar into the driving rain, utilizing the weather and darkness as camouflage. The Remington rifle was secured across her back, but it wouldn't be her primary weapon for what came next. Instead, she carried specialized equipment rarely seen outside elite tracking units, tools designed for hunting the most dangerous human prey. She moved upslope toward the Aspen Ridge, using a route that paralleled the main trail, but remained concealed from casual observation. The ascent was steep and treacherous in the storm, loose rocks threatening to betray her position with sound, but Rebecca navigated by feel and memory, placing each foot with deliberate precision. Halfway up the ridge, she paused, listening intently. Through the storm's cacophony, she detected the distinctive sounds of multiple vehicles laboring up the service road that wound toward the ridge top. Blackwood's men taking the only route accessible by SUV. Rebecca smiled grimly in the darkness. Their reliance on vehicles made their approach predictable and limited their tactical options. She continued her ascent, reaching the ridge crest well ahead of the approaching vehicles. Michael's grave lay in a small clearing among the aspens, marked by a simple headstone. Rebecca had selected this spot for its view of the valley and the sunrise Michael had loved to watch. Now she concealed herself 20 yards away, using the aspen trunks and undergrowth as cover. Soon, headlights pierced the darkness as the vehicles labored up the final approach. They stopped 50 yards from the gravesite, and men deployed in tactical formation, using handheld spotlights to illuminate their path through the storm. Rebecca counted 7 men emerging from the vehicles. 1 remained behind the wheel of the lead SUV, engine running, their extraction plan if needed. Blackwood himself directed operations from the center of the group, gesturing toward the grave with authority. 2 men moved forward with shovels and a portable ground-penetrating radar unit. They intended to scan the grave before digging, looking for something they believed might be buried with Michael. The systematic desecration of her husband's resting place ignited something primal in Rebecca, something that transcended her military training and awakened instincts far more ancient. She was no longer simply an operative responding to a threat. She was a hunter, protecting her territory, her mate's memory, her home. She reached into a pouch on her tactical vest, removing several small devices and activating them with practiced movements. Then, moving with fluid silence despite the treacherous conditions, she began to circle the perimeter of the clearing, placing the devices at strategic intervals. The men at the grave had set up portable lights and deployed the radar equipment. Heedless of the sacrilege they committed, their focus on the task made them vulnerable, a fundamental error when operating in hostile territory. Rebecca completed her circuit, returning to her original position with the trap set. She removed a small controller from another pouch and waited for the precise moment when the men were most concentrated around the grave. The first device detonated with a blinding flash and disorienting sound, not an explosion designed to kill, but to create sensory overload and confusion. The second and third devices activated seconds later, creating the impression of an organized attack from multiple directions. The men reacted with professional speed, but compromised coordination, some taking defensive positions, others returning fire at phantom targets, their training disrupted by the unexpected assault in unfamiliar terrain during a storm. Rebecca activated her night vision equipment, the familiar green-tinted clarity revealing the chaos she'd created. Blackwood was shouting orders, attempting to regain control of his disoriented team, directing fire toward the tree line opposite Rebecca's position. She moved then, utilizing the confusion to eliminate the driver of the lead SUV with a tranquilizer. Dart delivered with silent precision. The man slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious but alive. Rebecca was creating witnesses, not corpses. Next, she targeted the communication specialist she'd identified during her earlier observation, the dart finding its mark in the exposed neck beneath his tactical helmet. He collapsed mid-transmission, his radio emitting static that further contributed to the team's disorientation. 2 down, 6 remaining, including Blackwood. The team was regrouping now, their training reasserting itself as they established a defensive perimeter around the gravesite. Rebecca triggered the final set of devices, smoke canisters that released thick white clouds, further obscuring vision and creating additional confusion about the number and position of their attackers. Through the chaos of gunfire, shouted commands, blinding lights and disorienting smoke, a voice suddenly cut through, clear, female, and chillingly calm. Rebecca had activated a small speaker system placed during her circuit of the clearing, and now her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Anton Zakarian sends his regards, Mr. Blackwood." The effect was immediate and electric. Blackwood froze momentarily, his head swiveling to locate the source of the voice. "You came looking for Artemis," the voice continued, seeming to shift position with each word. "Congratulations, you found her." Gunfire erupted as Blackwood's men fired desperately into the smoke and darkness, but their shots found nothing but trees and empty air. "Michael Mitchell knew the truth about Shadowfall," Rebecca's voice continued, methodically laying out facts only someone intimately familiar with the operation would know. "He knew about Zakarian's protection network. He knew about your company's involvement, and he documented everything before he died." The men's fire became increasingly erratic, fear overtaking training, as they realized they weren't facing a simple widow, but something far more dangerous. "The question you should be asking," Rebecca's voice continued, "isn't whether I have that documentation. The question is who I've already sent it to." Through her night vision, Rebecca watched Blackwood's composure crack for the first time. He activated his satellite phone, barking urgent commands that confirmed her suspicions. He was calling for extraction or reinforcements. The operation was compromised, the target more dangerous than anticipated. Rebecca's voice delivered the final psychological blow. 7 of your men are still upright, Blackwood. Let's see how many make it off this ridge." The statement transformed their fear into terror. They no longer knew if they were hunters or prey, if they faced one opponent or many, if escape was even possible. It was time for Artemis to truly emerge from the shadows. The storm reached its crescendo as Rebecca executed the next phase of her strategy. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the ridge in stark white flashes that disrupted night vision equipment and cast violent shadows among the aspens. Nature itself seemed to have allied with her against the intruders. Through the chaos she'd created, Rebecca identified her highest value target, Blackwood himself. As the operations leader, his elimination from the field would amplify the team's disorientation and potentially force a retreat. She circled behind his position, using the thunderclaps to mask her movement through the underbrush. Blackwood had positioned himself behind a large aspen, satellite phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated what was clearly becoming an extraction, rather than an assault. His back was protected by the tree, but his focus on the communication made him momentarily vulnerable from the flank. Rebecca closed the distance with predatory patience, timing her approach with the storm's rhythm. 20 yards, 15, 10, close enough to hear fragments of his transmission despite the downpour. Situation compromised. Target is former Shadowfall operative. Immediate extraction required. The confirmation that he knew exactly who she was eliminated any remaining doubt about his mission. This wasn't about land or water rights. It was an assassination operation targeting her specifically because of what she knew about Operation Shadowfall. 5 yards now. Rebecca drew the combat knife from her tactical vest. A specialized blade, designed for silent operations. Her intention wasn't to kill, but to capture. Blackwood possessed information she needed, connections to whoever had ordered this operation. A sudden shift in the wind brought her scent to Blackwood's awareness a moment before she struck. His training immediately kicked in as he dropped the satellite phone and pivoted, drawing his sidearm with impressive speed. Not fast enough. Rebecca's first strike disarmed him, the blade slicing across his wrist with surgical precision, damaging tendons without severing major arteries. His weapon fell into the mud as he staggered backward, shock and recognition battling for dominance. In his expression, "Mitchell," he gasped, clutching his injured wrist. "Or should I say Artemis? Who sent you?" Rebecca demanded, blade held at ready position, her body coiled for his inevitable counterattack. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, professional calculation replacing initial surprise. "You know exactly who. The same people who buried Shadowfall. The same people who made sure your husband never testified." The implication struck Rebecca like a physical blow. Michael's cancer was extremely convenient for certain interests, Blackwood confirmed, his smile cruel despite his compromised position. Just like your tragic accident would have been, rage threatened to overwhelm Rebecca's tactical discipline. But 3 years of grief had tempered her emotional responses. She channeled the anger into focus, maintaining combat distance as Blackwood attempted to maneuver. "Zakarian is still alive," she stated, watching his reaction carefully. A flicker of surprise crossed his features before he could suppress it. "You're more informed than we anticipated. Doesn't matter now." Lightning flashed, illuminating movement in Rebecca's peripheral vision, one of Blackwood's men circling to flank her position. She'd lingered too long in one place, allowing them to triangulate her location. Blackwood saw it too, his confidence returning. "You're good, Mitchell. Best tracker in the program's history. But you're alone, and my team is still operational." Rebecca allowed herself a cold smile. "Am I alone?" On cue, a series of sharp cracks echoed from the edge of the clearing, precise rifle shots that found non-lethal targets with unerring accuracy. 2 more of Blackwood's men went down, clutching wounded limbs and shouting warnings to their comrades. Blackwood's expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty. "Who? Clearwater Springs takes care of its own," Rebecca interrupted, backing away into the shadows, knowing what was coming next. Sheriff Lawson's authoritative voice boomed through a megaphone, cutting through the storm's rumble. "This is the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. The property is surrounded. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." The tactical situation had reversed completely. What had begun as a covert elimination operation was now a very public confrontation with local law enforcement. Whatever shadow agency had dispatched Blackwood would want no part of such exposure. Confusion erupted among the remaining operatives as they tried to process this new threat while still searching for Rebecca in the darkness. Blackwood seized the momentary distraction to lunge at her, a secondary weapon appearing from an ankle holster. Rebecca anticipated the move, sidestepping with fluid grace and delivering a precise strike to his brachial plexus. The blow temporarily paralyzed his arm, sending the weapon spinning away into the underbrush. Before he could recover, she swept his legs from beneath him, driving him face first into the mud. "You have no idea what you're involved in," Blackwood snarled as she secured his hands with tactical restraints. "The people I work for, they don't stop. Ever." "Neither do I," Rebecca replied, her voice deadly calm. "And unlike you, I know this territory." She delivered a carefully measured blow to the base of his skull, rendering him unconscious but not seriously injured. Evidence and testimony would be required for what came next. Turning her attention to the remaining chaos, Rebecca activated her communications device. Sheriff, east side of the clearing. 2 down by the vehicles, 1 by the grave. Blackwood is secured. Copy that, Lawson's voice crackled through the speaker. We've got 2 more trying to escape down the service road. Deputies in pursuit. The operation had transitioned from guerrilla tactics to law enforcement containment. Rebecca moved quickly to secure the site, collecting Blackwood's satellite phone and other evidence before it could be destroyed or lost in the confusion. As she worked, a familiar figure materialized from the tree line, Wade Johnson, cradling a scoped hunting rifle, with the comfortable familiarity of a former ranger. Behind him came Billy Hawkins, the young ranch hand whose innocent appearance masked unexpected competence with his own weapon. Figured you could use some backup, Wade said simply, surveying the subdued operatives with professional assessment. Billy, he is quite the shot when he needs to be. The young man looked simultaneously proud and shaken by the night's events. My dad always said Miss Mitchell wasn't just any rancher. Your dad was right, Rebecca acknowledged, feeling the strange disconnect of her 2 identities colliding in this rain-soaked confrontation. Though I'd appreciate it if that particular observation didn't spread too far. More deputies arrived, securing the site and processing the captured operatives. Rebecca briefed Sheriff Lawson away from the others, providing enough information to justify the arrests without revealing classified details that would complicate matters. So these men were after you, specifically, Lawson confirmed, rain dripping from the brim of his hat as lightning continued to illuminate the ridge at irregular intervals. Not the water rights, not the property. Looks that way, Rebecca replied, maintaining the careful balance between truth and necessary omission. My husband's military connections made certain people nervous. They wanted to ensure I didn't have documentation that could compromise them. It wasn't the complete story, but it was enough for now. The full truth about Operation Shadowfall, about Zakarian's survival and protection by American interests, about Michael's suspicious illness. Those revelations would need to come through official channels with proper protection in place. This is bigger than my department, isn't it? Lawson asked, his expression suggesting he already knew the answer. Rebecca nodded. I need to make some calls to people who can handle it at the appropriate level. In the meantime, keep Blackwood isolated from the others. He's the key to everything. As the sheriff moved away to coordinate the prisoner transport, Rebecca felt the adrenaline that had sustained her beginning to ebb, leaving bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. The tactical gear that had felt so natural during the confrontation now seemed heavy and foreign, a remnant of a life she'd thought left behind. She made her way to Michael's grave, relieved to find it undisturbed despite Blackwood's intentions. The simple headstone stood stalwart in the storm, water streaming down its face like tears. I kept our home safe, she whispered, placing her hand on the cold stone. But it's not over yet. Not until we finish what Shadowfall started. Dawn was breaking by the time the ridge was cleared of Blackwood's men and equipment. The storm had passed, leaving a washed, clean world glistening in the early light. Rebecca stood with Lawson beside the sheriff's vehicle, watching as deputies processed the last of the evidence. Federal agents will be here by noon, Lawson informed her, checking his watch. Your call generated quite a response once it reached. The right people, Rebecca nodded. The secure transmission she'd sent using her old equipment had finally found its way to former contacts who understood its significance. The wheels of official investigation were turning, albeit more slowly than she might have wished. I need access to Blackwood before they arrive, she said. There are questions only he can answer. Lawson studied her face, recognizing the determination in her expression. I can give you 15 minutes at the station. That's all I can justify, without raising flags. It's enough, Rebecca assured him. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office occupied a modest building on Clearwater Springs Main Street, a small-town law enforcement center never designed to hold high-value prisoners with military backgrounds. Blackwood had been placed in the single secure cell, isolated from his captured team members who were being held in the larger general lockup. Rebecca entered the holding area alone, having changed from tactical gear into civilian clothes that would draw less attention from the gathering crowd of curious townsfolk outside. News of the night's events had spread quickly through the small community, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Blackwood sat on the cell's simple cot, his injured wrist professionally bandaged by the town's doctor. He looked up as Rebecca approached, his expression revealing neither surprise nor fear, only cold calculation. "Come to gloat, Artemis?" he asked, using her operational call sign deliberately. Rebecca remained standing beyond his reach, studying him with the same analytical precision she'd once applied to tracking targets through hostile territory. "I came for information. Give me something useful, and I'll make sure it's considered during your inevitable plea negotiations." A humorless smile twisted his features. "You think this ends with me in court? How naive for someone with your background." "4 of your men are already talking," Rebecca informed him, the statement only partially true, but delivered with convincing certainty. "Offering details in exchange for consideration. The smart play is to get ahead of them." Doubt flickered briefly. In Blackwood's eyes, the first crack in his professional facade. "What do you want to know? Zakarian, where is he now?" Blackwood's laugh held genuine amusement. "You really don't understand the game you're playing. Anton Zakarian doesn't exist anymore, hasn't for 3 years. Names change, men don't. Who is he now?" The operative leaned forward, his voice dropping. "He's the man who signs my checks. The man who built a new identity, with the blessing of people who sit in offices you've never been cleared to visit. The man who made your husband's cancer treatment fail." The last statement hit Rebecca like a physical blow, but she maintained her composure through sheer force of will. "Prove it. Check your husband's medical records, specifically the technician who administered his final round of chemotherapy. Man named Carrigan, former Special Activities Division, specializes in making natural causes look natural." Rebecca's mind raced, cataloging details and connections. The name Carrigan was vaguely familiar, a shadow operator mentioned in whispers rather than official documentation. The type of asset deployed when problems needed permanent solutions without traces. "Why come after me now? It's been 3 years." Blackwood shrugged, wincing slightly at the movement's effect on his injured wrist. "Zakarian's being considered for a cabinet-level position. Very public, very visible. The vetting process is intense. Your existence represents an unacceptable loose end." The implications were staggering. If Blackwood was telling the truth, the arms dealer responsible for ambushing her unit had not only escaped justice, but was on the verge of obtaining significant governmental power. "Do you have proof of this?" Rebecca pressed. "Of course not," Blackwood replied. "Men like me don't get proof. We get orders." Their conversation was interrupted by Sheriff Lawson's appearance at the holding area entrance. "Feds just pulled into town. 5 vehicles looking very official." Rebecca nodded, turning back to Blackwood for one final question. "The documentation my husband kept. What exactly were you looking for?" Something like respect flickered across the operative's features. Operation Shadowfall wasn't just about Zakarian. It was about what he was transporting that day. Prototype, targeting system with applications beyond anything publicly acknowledged. Your husband was the mission planner. He knew the manifest details, knew exactly what went missing after the ambush. And if that technology suddenly appeared in a cabinet member's private company portfolio, questions would be asked that certain people don't want to answer, Blackwood confirmed. "Now you understand the stakes." Rebecca studied him a moment longer, committing his features to memory. "I do. Thank you for your cooperation." As she turned to leave, Blackwood called after her, his voice carrying a warning that raised the hairs on her neck. "They won't stop. Mitchell, one team fails, another deploys. That's how this works. You've won a skirmish, not the war." She paused at the doorway, glancing back over her shoulder. "You forget, Blackwood. Hunting is what I do best." Outside, the sleepy main street of Clearwater Springs had transformed into a hub of federal activity. Black SUVs with government plates lined the curb, and agents in tactical gear and suits established a perimeter around the sheriff's office. Rebecca observed them from the shadows of the building's side entrance, cataloguing details that told her exactly which agencies were represented and which were conspicuously absent. The team appeared to be primarily FBI with support elements from Homeland Security, but no representatives from military intelligence or the specialized units that would normally handle cases touching on classified operations. A selective response. Controlled, sanitized, Sheriff Lawson approached, looking uncomfortable in the face of the federal presence overtaking his jurisdiction. "Agent in charge is asking for you specifically. Man named Crawford." The name triggered no recognition, which itself was significant. If this were a legitimate follow-up to her secure transmission, the response team would have included at least one officer from her former chain of command. "Tell him I'll be available shortly," Rebecca replied, making a quick decision. "I need to check something at the clinic first." Lawson nodded, understanding the subtext of her request. "I'll stall them as long as I can. Paperwork, jurisdictional. Questions, the usual." Rebecca slipped away through the back streets of Clearwater Springs, avoiding the main thoroughfares where federal agents were establishing presence. Her destination was the small medical clinic where Dr. Sarah Wilson maintained patient records for the entire community, including Michael's cancer treatment documentation. The clinic was quiet at this early hour, the morning receptionist not yet arrived for her shift. Rebecca used her status as a former patient's spouse to gain access from the night nurse who was preparing to end her shift. "I just need to check something in Michael's file," she explained, projecting calm authority. "Dr. Wilson mentioned some genetic markers that might be relevant to family planning." The explanation was accepted without question, one benefit of small-town relationships built over years. Rebecca was led to the records room and left alone with her husband's substantial medical file. She worked quickly, scanning through the treatment notes with practiced efficiency. Michael's cancer had progressed with unusual aggression, confounding the specialists they'd consulted. His final round of chemotherapy, administered just weeks before his death, had been overseen by a visiting oncology specialist brought in from a regional medical center. There, on the signature line of the treatment authorization, Dr. James Carrigan, Rebecca photographed the document with her phone, then carefully returned the file to its proper location. The confirmation of Blackwood's information sent ice through her veins. Michael's death hadn't been a tragic natural occurrence. It had been a calculated elimination of a potential witness, which meant everything else Blackwood had told her was likely true as well. Anton Zakarian, alive and positioned for political power. The stolen technology, presumably now incorporated into supposedly legitimate business ventures. The high-level protection that had shielded these operations from scrutiny. As she exited the clinic through a rear entrance, Rebecca spotted two federal agents approaching the front door. The net was tightening, not just around Blackwood and his team, but around her as well. As she activated the satellite phone Lawson had given her, connecting not to the sheriff, but to a number she'd memorized years ago, an emergency contact provided during her final mission briefing. The call connected after several rings. Authentication. A male voice prompted without introduction. Artemis verification, November Sierra 74 Alpha. A pause, then, Authentication accepted. Status compromised. Shadowfall assets active. Selective containment in progress. Another pause. Longer. This time. Understood. Secure position and await contact. Estimated window 6 hours. The line went dead. Rebecca pocketed the phone, weighing her options. The federal agents now controlling Clearwater Springs would soon realize she had evaded their initial containment. Their response would depend on their actual mission parameters, whether they were legitimate investigators or part of the cover-up Blackwood had described. Either way, she couldn't remain in town. The evidence she'd gathered needed to reach trustworthy hands, and her own safety was compromised as long as she remained within easy reach of whoever had dispatched Blackwood's team. Rebecca Mitchell, widow, rancher, community member, had successfully defended her home. Now Artemis, tracker, operative, survivor, needed to go on the offensive to finish what Operation Shadowfall had started 3 years ago. It was time to become a hunter once more. Rebecca moved through the back alleys of Clearwater Springs with practiced invisibility, a ghost in her own hometown. Federal agents had established checkpoints at major intersections, their presence transforming the sleepy Montana community into something resembling a military occupation. Her immediate priority was clear: reach her ranch, retrieve Michael's documentation and her essential equipment, then disappear before the net closed completely. The verification code she'd received during her emergency call confirmed her worst fears. The operation against her was sanctioned at levels high enough to co-opt legitimate federal resources. The question was whether those now controlling Clearwater Springs were compromised agents or simply unwitting tools in a larger conspiracy. Either way, Rebecca couldn't risk capture or even official protection until she understood exactly who could be trusted. She paused in the shadow of the feed store, observing the main street through a narrow gap between buildings. The federal presence had expanded in the 20 minutes since she'd left the clinic, additional vehicles arriving, communications equipment being established, agents interviewing locals with clipboards and stern expressions. A containment operation, not just an investigation. Someone very powerful was working to ensure that whatever had begun at Willow Creek Ranch ended in Clearwater Springs. A hand touched her shoulder without warning. Rebecca pivoted instantly, a combat knife appearing in her grip before conscious thought could form, only to find herself facing Billy Hawkins, her young ranch hand, who stumbled back with wide eyes at her reaction. "Miss Mitchell," he gasped, raising his hands in surrender. "It's just me." Rebecca lowered the knife immediately, adrenaline still coursing through her system. "Billy, you shouldn't be here." "Sheriff Lawson sent me to find you," the young man explained, still eyeing the knife as she resheathed it. "Said to tell you they're searching vehicles leaving town, checking IDs. They've got your photo." The development wasn't surprising, but confirmed the urgency of her situation. "Where's Lawson?" "Now. Is still at the station with those government types. He's stalling them, asking for warrants, jurisdiction, paperwork, that kind of thing." Rebecca nodded, grateful for the sheriff's interference, but knowing it would buy her minutes at most. "I need to get back to the ranch." Billy's face lit up with unexpected confidence. "That's why I'm here. My dad's livestock truck is behind the feed store. I can get you past the checkpoints. They're not stopping commercial vehicles yet." The offer presented both opportunity and risk. Involving Billy further endangered him, but attempting to leave town on foot would almost certainly result in capture. "Your father know you're doing this?" she asked, studying his face. The young man straightened his shoulders. "Dad's the one who suggested it, said we owe you for what you did for us last winter." Last winter, when Rebecca had tracked the Hawkins prized, breeding bull through a blizzard, finding the valuable animal half-frozen in a ravine and organizing its rescue. A simple act of neighborly assistance that now yielded unexpected dividends. "Lead the way," she decided. "But Billy, after this, you go home and stay there. Tell your father to deny any knowledge if they come asking. Understand?" He nodded solemnly, leading her through a narrow passage between buildings to where an aging livestock truck idled, its engine rumbling with the distinctive sound of well-maintained but elderly machinery. The truck's side panels displayed the Hawkins Ranch logo, a legitimate local business that would raise minimal suspicion at checkpoints. Billy helped her into the cab, then circled to the driver's side and put the vehicle in gear. "Low profile," Rebecca instructed as they pulled onto a side street. "Normal speed, normal driving, we're just making a regular delivery." Billy nodded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, but his driving steady as they approached the first checkpoint at the eastern edge of town. 2 federal agents and a deputy stood beside sawhorses, partially blocking the road, checking vehicles and IDs. The deputy recognized the truck, raising a hand in casual greeting as Billy slowed. The federal agents glanced at the livestock truck with minimal interest, their attention focused on passenger vehicles that might contain their target. "Morning, Billy," the deputy called. "Early start today?" "Feed delivery to the Sullivan place," Billy responded, his voice remarkably steady for a 19-year-old engaged in evading a federal manhunt. "They've got calves dropping and need extra supplies. The mundane details of ranching life, always the best cover in rural communities." The deputy waved them through without further questions, the federal agents not even approaching the truck. Rebecca released a measured breath as they cleared the checkpoint, impressed by Billy's performance. "You did well." "Wasn't even lying," he replied with a hint of pride. "We are making a delivery to the Sullivans later today. Dad always says the best cover is mostly the truth." An unexpectedly sophisticated understanding of tradecraft from a young ranch hand. Rebecca filed the observation away for future consideration as they continued east toward Willow Creek Ranch. "They've been asking questions about you all morning," Billy continued, eyes fixed on the road. "Those federal types. Going door to door in town, wanting to know about your background, your visitors, your comings and goings. What are people telling them?" A small smile touched Billy's face. "Not much. Folks in Clearwater Springs don't much care for outsiders, asking questions, especially when they come in looking like an invasion force." The road wound through pine forests and rolling hills, the landscape opening occasionally to reveal valleys where cattle grazed on autumn pastures. It was a beautiful country, the kind of place where people valued privacy and self-sufficiency above most other virtues. "Those men who came after you," Billy said after a comfortable silence, "they weren't just rustlers or land grabbers, were they?" Rebecca considered how much to share with the young man who had risked himself to help her. "No," she acknowledged, "they weren't. Because of what you used to do, before you came here with Mr. Mitchell?" She turned to study him directly. "What do you think I used to do, Billy?" He kept his eyes on the road, but his expression grew serious beyond his years. "My dad served 3 tours with special forces before taking over the family ranch. He recognized something in the way you move, the way you track, said you had the look of someone who'd operated in places that don't appear on regular maps. Yes, the assessment was surprisingly accurate. Your father is an observant man. He said, if you ever needed help, we should provide it without questions. Said people who've served like you did have earned that much. The simple statement of loyalty, soldier. To soldier, regardless of specific unit or assignment, touched Rebecca more deeply than she'd expected. The code among those who had seen combat together transcended ordinary social bonds. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. "And I won't forget it." They created a final ridge, and Willow Creek Ranch came into view in the valley below. From this distance, everything appeared normal. The house and outbuildings undisturbed, cattle grazing peacefully in the lower pastures. But Rebecca's trained eye caught the subtle signs of ongoing surveillance. A glint of reflected light from the tree line north of the property, likely a spotting scope or camera lens. Tire tracks on the service road that hadn't been there the previous day. The unusual absence of birds near the barn, where they typically congregated in the morning hours. "Stop here," she instructed Billy. "This is close enough." The young man looked uncertain. "I can take you all the way in." Rebecca shook her head. "They're watching the property. You drive in there, you'll be on their radar permanently." Understanding dawned on his face. "What should I tell my dad?" "Tell him thank you, and that I'll remember the Hawkins family when this is over." She gathered her minimal gear from the truck cab. "Now turn around and make that delivery to the Sullivans. If anyone asks, you never saw me after the federal agents arrived in town." Billy nodded solemnly. "Good luck, Ms. Mitchell." After the truck rumbled away, Rebecca surveyed the terrain between her current position and the ranch. The direct approach was clearly being monitored, which meant she needed an alternative route, one that would be unexpected even for those familiar with the property. She descended from the ridge using natural cover, moving through a series of draws and ravines that local hunters rarely utilize due to their difficult access. The approach added time, but provided nearly complete concealment from the surveillance positions she'd identified. 2 hours of careful movement brought her to the northwest corner of her property, a rocky area bounded by a seasonal stream currently reduced to a trickle by the autumn drought. The terrain was challenging enough that few would expect anyone to use it as an access point, particularly someone supposedly unfamiliar with special operations infiltration techniques. Rebecca paused at the property line, conducting a detailed survey of the surrounding area before proceeding. No sign of surveillance on this approach, as she'd anticipated. The watchers had focused their resources on more conventional access routes. She moved along the stream bed, using its natural depression for cover until reaching the stand of cottonwoods that marked the edge of her northern pasture. From there, she utilized a drainage culvert that ran beneath the pasture to the equipment shed, an uncomfortable but effective concealed approach to the heart of her property. Emerging behind the equipment shed, Rebecca confirmed the absence of immediate surveillance before accessing the hidden entrance to the storm cellar. Inside, she quickly gathered essential supplies, specialized tracking equipment, communications gear, weapons, and most importantly, Michael's complete documentation on Operation Shadowfall and the technologies that had been the true target of that mission. The comprehensive file contained details that would be devastating to whoever Zakarian had become. Technical specifications, shipping manifests, financial transactions, and most damning photographic evidence. Michael had been thorough in his documentation, driven perhaps by premonition of what was to come. Rebecca secured the most critical evidence in a weatherproof pack designed for extended field operations, along with supplies that would sustain her for up to 2 weeks in the wilderness if necessary. The weight was substantial but manageable for someone with her training. As she prepared to depart, a sudden electronic tone from her secure communication device interrupted the process. The contact promised during her earlier authentication call was incoming sooner than expected. "Artemis secure," she answered. "Using operational protocol. Phoenix actual," came the response, the voice immediately recognizable despite the years since she'd last heard it. Colonel James Hargrove, former commanding officer of her specialized tracking unit and one of the few senior officers she had trusted implicitly. "Situation critical," Rebecca reported without preamble. "Shadowfall compromised at the highest levels. Mitchell's documentation confirms Zakarian's survival and identity transfer. Blackwood team neutralized, but federal containment team appears compromised." "Understood." Hargrove's voice remained steady, but Rebecca detected the underlying tension of a commander processing significant tactical developments. "Your current position secure?" "Temporarily. Property under surveillance. Town under federal control. Extraction. Routes limited. A brief pause followed, Hargrove weighing options and resources. Rally point established, sending coordinates now. Authentication Sierra Tango 95 Delta. ETA to support. 20 hours. The device displayed a set of coordinates Rebecca immediately recognized as a remote hunting cabin deep in the national forest bordering her property, isolated, defensible, and accessible only to those intimately familiar with the wilderness. Terrain. The authentication code confirmed this was a legitimate extraction plan, not a trap. Copy rally point, she confirmed. Need to know. Containment team status. Unknown loyalty, Hargrove admitted. Operation authorized through channels that bypass normal oversight. Proceed with extreme caution. Trust no federal identification until authentication is confirmed at rally point. The implications were sobering. If Zakarian's influence extended far enough to authorize a federal operating outside normal channels, the conspiracy reached higher than even Blackwood had suggested. Understood. Artemis is moving to the rally point. As she ended the transmission, Rebecca faced the moment of truth, the decision point that would determine not just her immediate actions, but the direction of her life moving forward. She could surrender to the federal team in town, hope that legitimate authorities would sort truth from deception, and potentially return to her life as Rebecca Mitchell, rancher and widow, once the situation clarified. Or she could fully embrace the identity she'd tried to leave behind, becoming Artemis once more, the hunter who tracked targets others couldn't find, the operative who moved unseen through impossible terrain, the woman who had once been the military's deadliest asset in the shadow war against high-value targets. The choice crystallized as she heard vehicles approaching on the main access road, the federal containment team, abandoning subtlety now that they'd lost patience with Sheriff Lawson's delaying tactics. Rebecca ascended through the storm cellars, concealed exit, emerging into the afternoon sunlight in time to see 3 black SUVs turning onto her property, dust billowing behind them as they accelerated toward the main house. In that moment, seeing unknown agents approaching the home she had built with Michael, the decision made itself. Whatever peace Rebecca Mitchell might have found in Willow Creek Ranch had been shattered the moment Blackwood's team had violated her property. There would be no returning to that life until she eliminated the threat at its source, not just the operative sent to kill her, but the man who had ordered Michael's death and now sought to silence her as well. She secured her pack and moved toward the northern property line, utilizing natural cover and the terrain knowledge that gave her an insurmountable advantage over the agents now searching her home. Their perimeter security was professional, but designed to prevent escape via conventional routes. Roads, trails, obvious geographical features. They weren't prepared for someone with her specialized infiltration training and intimate knowledge of the wilderness beyond. As Rebecca slipped across her property boundary into the national forest that would provide her path to the rally point, she left behind more than just pursuing agents. She shed the identity of Rebecca Mitchell like an outgrown skin, feeling the familiar cold focus of Artemis settling into her mind and body, the hunter awakening fully after years of dormancy. The agents searching her empty house would find evidence of Rebecca Mitchell, rancher and widow. They might even uncover fragments of her military service record, enough to understand she was more than she appeared. What they wouldn't find was any trace of her current location or intentions. They had come hunting a witness they hoped to silence. Instead, they had activated the most lethal tracker the special operations community had ever produced, a predator now focused exclusively on the man who had ordered her husband's death. She moved through the wilderness with the fluid efficiency that had once made her legendary among specialized tracking units. Rebecca felt a strange sense of liberation. For 3 years, she had honored Michael's memory by attempting to build the peaceful life they had planned together. Now she would honor him by finishing the mission he had died trying to complete, exposing Zakarian and the corruption that had protected him. The Montana wilderness opened before her, thousands of acres of rugged terrain that ordinary operatives would find nearly impossible to navigate. For Artemis, it was simply her element, the environment where her skills found their purest expression. Behind her, men with guns and technology would search in expanding patterns, following conventional pursuit protocols. Ahead lay 20 miles of wilderness between her current position and the rally point coordinates, challenging terrain that would defeat most trackers. But Rebecca Mitchell had never been most trackers. As Artemis, she had once pursued a high-value target across 80 miles of Afghan mountains in winter conditions, navigating by stars when technology failed, reading the land when maps proved inadequate, finding her quarry when satellite surveillance and drone reconnaissance had failed completely. 20 miles of Montana wilderness. That wasn't an escape route, it was a home field advantage. As dusk approached, Rebecca paused on a rocky outcropping that provided a clear view of her property in the valley below. The federal team had established a formal search perimeter, vehicles positioned at key points, agents moving in coordinated patterns across her land. Watching their methodical but fundamentally flawed approach, Rebecca felt the last hesitation fade from her mind. These men might be following orders, might even believe they were pursuing a legitimate security threat, but they were pawns in a larger game, one that had already claimed Michael's life and would claim many more if Zakarian's reach extended into government. As Blackwood had claimed, the peaceful life she had built in Montana had been an illusion, or perhaps more accurately, a temporary reprieve. The skills that had made her Artemis hadn't atrophied during her years as Rebecca Mitchell. They had simply been redirected toward different purposes. Now those skills would serve their original function once more. She turned away from the valley, view facing the wilderness that would be both her refuge and her path forward. The decision was made. Artemis would hunt again, and God help the men who had awakened her. As night descended on the Montana wilderness, transforming the landscape into a realm of shadow and silence. For most pursuers, darkness represented a significant disadvantage, limited visibility, increased risk of injury, and the psychological burden of operating in an unfamiliar environment where every sound triggered primal alarms in the human mind. For Artemis, darkness was an ally. Rebecca moved through the forest with the fluid economy of a predator. Each step, placed with deliberate precision, her night vision equipment remained secured in her pack, unnecessary for now, as her eyes had adjusted to the natural illumination provided by the quarter moon and brilliant canopy of stars. Years of operating in environments where electronic assistance could be detected or disrupted had honed her natural night vision to exceptional levels. 4 miles separated her from the pursuing federal agents, a distance she'd established during the initial phase of her evasion. Now she paused at the edge of a small clearing, senses fully engaged in reading the wilderness around her. The night air carried information to her trained awareness, the movement of small animals returning to normal patterns in her wake, confirming no pursuit had disrupted them recently. The subtle shift in wind direction that would mask her scent from tracking dogs if they were deployed. The distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the east, likely a surveillance asset called in to support the ground teams. Rebecca consulted her mental map of the terrain, calculating the helicopter's probable search pattern based on standard federal protocols. The aircraft would utilize thermal imaging equipment, effective technology, but limited by environmental factors. The limestone outcroppings 2 miles north would mask her heat signature if she positioned herself correctly. The extensive pine Forest between her current location and the rally point would provide intermittent concealment from aerial observation. She adjusted her route accordingly, moving deeper into the forest where the dense canopy would reduce her vulnerability to aerial detection. The pack on her back contained equipment that could jam or spoof electronic surveillance, but using it would create an electronic signature that might actually draw attention rather than avoiding it. Better to rely on environmental factors and fieldcraft, the skills that had made her legendary long before advanced technology had become standard issue. 3 hours of careful movement brought Rebecca to a ridgeline overlooking a narrow valley. She paused, utilizing a natural observation point concealed by rock formations and vegetation. Below, headlights pierced the darkness, vehicles moving along the logging road that provided the most direct access to the remote regions where the rally point coordinates were located. The federal containment team had expanded their search perimeter faster than standard procedure would dictate, suggesting they had specific intelligence about her potential destinations or assistance from someone familiar with her operational history. Rebecca studied the vehicle movement patterns, identifying standard search grid implementation, but with modifications that revealed sophisticated tactical leadership. Whoever commanded this operation understood pursuit dynamics at a level beyond typical federal agents. She needed more specific intelligence about the pursuing force to formulate an effective evasion strategy. Simply running wasn't enough. Not when the opposition demonstrated this level of tactical competence and resource deployment. Rebecca descended toward the logging road, utilizing a game trail that paralleled it at a distance of approximately 200 yards. Close enough to gather intelligence, far enough to maintain a secure withdrawal route if detected. The sound of vehicles grew louder as she approached. She dropped into a prone position at the edge of a small rise, extracting compact binoculars. From her pack, the night vision capability revealed details of the federal operation below. 4 vehicles total, 2 standard black SUVs, consistent with federal agency motor pools, but also 2 specialized tactical vehicles with modifications. She recognized immediately. The distinctive profile and equipment configuration belonged to a specialized manhunting unit formed after her departure from service, the Fugitive Apprehension Tactical Team, or FATT, as it was unofficially known among operators. These weren't standard federal agents. They were specialized trackers with advanced training specifically designed to locate and capture high-value targets in wilderness environments. The realization transformed Rebecca's tactical calculus. These pursuers would not be easily evaded. Using standard techniques, they would anticipate common evasion strategies, recognize false trails, and maintain operational discipline throughout extended pursuit scenarios. She was facing hunters nearly as skilled as herself. Rebecca shifted her observation focus to the personnel deploying from the vehicles. 12 operators total, moving with the coordinated precision that spoke of extensive training and field experience. Their equipment was state-of-the-art. Advanced communications, thermal imaging devices, and tracking technology that hadn't existed during her active service years. But technology couldn't replace experience and intuition. As she observed their deployment pattern, Rebecca identified their fundamental error. They were establishing a search grid based on standard human movement patterns and terrain utilization. Their approach assumed logical route selection by the target, prioritizing energy conservation and directional consistency. Artemis had never been a standard target. Rebecca catalogued the team's equipment, capabilities, and deployment pattern before withdrawing from her observation position. The intelligence gathered would shape her strategy moving forward, not simply avoiding these pursuers, but potentially turning their pursuit against them to gather additional information about who had dispatched them. She moved away from the logging, road, ascending toward higher terrain where tracking would be more challenging due to rocky ground that held fewer impressions. As she climbed, a plan formed in her mind. Not merely reactive evasion, but a proactive approach that would provide answers while maintaining her progress toward the rally point. The specialized pursuit team represented an opportunity to determine exactly who was directing the operation against her. While federal resources had been deployed, the specific composition of this team suggested authorization at levels beyond standard law enforcement, precisely the kind of signature that could lead her back to those protecting Zakarian. Dawn found Rebecca positioned on a rocky promontory overlooking the expanding search grid below. The pursuit teams had maintained operational discipline throughout the night, establishing a methodical coverage pattern that would have trapped most fugitives. Their coordination was impressive, communication protocols maintaining operational security while ensuring comprehensive terrain coverage. But their search was concentrated in the wrong area. While standard evasion doctrine would have taken a fugitive north toward the Canadian border or east toward the interstate, where transportation options multiplied, Rebecca had moved west into increasingly rugged terrain, a direction that appeared to offer no strategic advantage and significantly increased the physical demands of movement, precisely why it was the perfect choice. The morning revealed the full scale of resources deployed against her. In addition to the ground teams, 2 helicopters now circled in coordinated search patterns, and satellite resources had likely been tasked to the area as well, given the priority this operation apparently held. Rebecca allowed herself a brief moment of professional admiration for the operation's scope, even as she prepared to dismantle it. The rally point remained her primary objective, but the pursuit team's presence offered a secondary opportunity she couldn't ignore, the chance to identify exactly who had authorized this extraordinary manhunt. Moving with careful precision, she descended to a small stream that cut through the forest below her observation point. Water would mask her scent trail from tracking dogs and provide natural concealment from thermal imaging due to its consistent temperature difference from the surrounding terrain. She followed the stream for nearly a mile before identifying a suitable location for her counterintelligence operation. A rocky outcropping created a natural choke point where the stream narrowed, forcing anyone following her apparent trail to pass through a predictable location. As Rebecca withdrew specialized equipment from her pack, not sophisticated electronic countermeasures, but simple tools utilized by trackers since ancient times. False trail indicators, scent diversions, physical markers that would appear natural to casual observation but broadcast specific information to trained trackers. She laid these with meticulous care, creating the impression of a fugitive growing increasingly desperate and making minor but detectable errors in fieldcraft. To an expert tracker, these signs would create a compelling narrative of exhaustion and diminishing tactical discipline, precisely the patterns they would be seeking. The false trail led away from the stream toward a dense stand of pines that offered apparent concealment, but actually created a natural surveillance zone where anyone approaching would be visible while believing themselves unobserved. With the diversion established, Rebecca doubled back along the stream, utilizing underwater movement for 50 yards, before emerging on the opposite bank and ascending toward rocky terrain where she would leave minimal physical evidence of passage. The entire operation consumed nearly 2 hours, time well invested if it yielded intelligence about her pursuers. From a concealed position 300 yards from her false trail, Rebecca settled in to observe the pursuers' response. The specialized equipment in her pack included a compact directional microphone that would allow her to monitor their communications once they discovered the trail she'd left for them. The wait was shorter than expected. Within 40 minutes, the distinctive sound of tactical movement through wilderness reached her position, operators moving with disciplined stealth, but detectable to her experienced senses nevertheless. Through her binoculars, Rebecca observed a four-person team approaching her false trail, the standard squad configuration for the specialized unit she'd identified earlier. Their movement patterns revealed extensive training, each operator covering specific sectors while maintaining team cohesion. They discovered her fabricated evidence exactly as intended, the point man identifying the first marker and signaling the team to implement tracking protocols. Rebecca activated the directional microphone, adjusting the focus until their communications became audible. Confirmed sign, Sector 7. The point man reported into his communications device. Pattern, consistent with target profile. The response came through clearly enough for Rebecca to hear both sides of the exchange. Acknowledged, replied a voice that carried the unmistakable cadence of command authority. Analysis, subject demonstrating advanced evasion techniques initially, but showing signs of degradation. Pattern suggests increasing fatigue or possible injury. Direction of movement trending northwest toward the Miller Ridge complex. A brief pause followed before the command voice responded. Maintain pursuit, but exercise extreme caution. Subject profile indicates potential for counter-tracking deception. The warning came too late to prevent the team from following exactly the path Rebecca had intended. But it confirmed something significant. Whoever commanded this operation was familiar with her capabilities at a detailed level. The team advanced cautiously along her false trail, their formation tightening as they approached the pine stand, where she'd created the illusion of a hasty concealment position. As they committed to the approach, Rebecca noted their communications channel designation and encryption pattern, information that would prove valuable for later intelligence gathering. The team leader signaled for standard containment protocol. As they prepared to breach the apparent hiding position, a textbook approach for apprehending a cornered fugitive. Their weapons readied, communications tightened, formation perfectly executed for maximum coverage with minimal exposure. Rebecca allowed herself a moment of professional appreciation as she observed their technique. These were exceptional operators, implementing their training with precision. Against an ordinary target, even one with military background, they would have been devastatingly effective. The team breached the pine stand with coordinated efficiency, only to discover the deception. Their communication traffic immediately reflected the realization that they'd been manipulated. "Stand down, false positive," the team leader reported, professional discipline evident despite the obvious frustration in his tone. Subject implemented counter-tracking measures. "We've been diverted." The command response came swiftly. "Understood. Full spectrum analysis of surrounding terrain. Subject's operational history indicates preference for high ground observation points within medium retreat range of deception locations." The assessment was unnervingly accurate, precisely the tactic Rebecca had employed during certain historical operations. The commander's familiarity with her methodologies suggested direct knowledge of her classified operational history, not merely generic tracking expertise. "Acknowledged," the team leader responded, implementing search pattern Delta 3 with emphasis on elevated positions within 500 meters. This development accelerated Rebecca's timetable. The team would reorient their search using highly sophisticated prediction models, potentially compromising her observation position before she'd gathered sufficient intelligence. She withdrew from her location with practiced silence, moving laterally rather than directly away from the search team, another counterintuitive choice that would defeat standard pursuit algorithms. As she created distance, she continued monitoring their communications, extracting valuable data about their operational parameters and command structure. The team's deployment pattern and technological resources confirmed her initial assessment. This was not standard federal law enforcement, but a specialized unit with access to classified tactical systems. Their operational security protocols matched those used by units under direct Pentagon control rather than Justice Department oversight. This wasn't a criminal investigation. It was a military operation on domestic soil, something that required authorization at the highest levels of government. Rebecca processed this information as she established a new route toward the rally point coordinates. If military assets had been deployed domestically against a U.S. citizen, the authorization chain would involve specific protocols and documentation. That chain could potentially lead directly to whoever was protecting Zakarian's new identity. 6 hours of disciplined evasion brought Rebecca to a network of limestone caves that provided both temporary shelter and natural concealment from aerial surveillance. She established a secure position deep enough for protection, but with a clear escape route, then extracted her secure communication device from the pack. The risk of signal detection was significant, but the intelligence she'd gathered warranted transmission to Colonel Hargrove. She composed a brief, encoded message, summarizing her observations about the pursuit team's composition, capabilities, and command protocols. The transmission would last less than 3 seconds, a compressed data burst utilizing frequency hopping, technology that would be difficult but not impossible to detect with modern signal intelligence equipment. The pursuing team would register the transmission, but would need time to triangulate its origin, time she would use to relocate immediately after sending. Rebecca activated the device, transmitted the encoded package, then immediately powered down the system before beginning her extraction from the cave network. The discipline protocol had been drilled into her through countless operations, never remaining at a transmission location, regardless of how secure it might appear. She emerged into late afternoon sunlight, quickly assessing the surrounding terrain for signs of pursuit. The helicopter activity had shifted, concentrating on a sector approximately 2 miles southeast of her position, likely responding to signal intelligence detection of her transmission despite its brevity. Rebecca moved northwest, utilizing natural terrain features to minimize her visible signature while maintaining efficient progress toward the rally point. The specialized equipment in her pack included limited water purification capability, allowing her to replenish supplies from streams without leaving evidence of fire used to boil water. As dusk approached, bringing the advantage of reduced aerial surveillance effectiveness, Rebecca detected the first evidence of a flanking maneuver by ground forces, subtle disturbances in the natural environment that most would overlook, but that registered clearly. To her trained senses, a second pursuit team had been deployed, apparently utilizing terrain analysis to predict her most likely route toward remote regions where extraction would be challenging for federal forces. Their projection was accurate enough to position them less than a mile from her actual location, too close for comfort given their resources and capabilities. Rebecca adjusted course immediately, implementing evasion protocols that prioritized minimal sign over speed of movement. Each footstep was placed with deliberate care, creating negligible disturbance in the forest floor. Vegetation was navigated without breaking branches or disrupting natural growth patterns. When crossing open ground became necessary, she selected rocky terrain that would minimize trackable impressions. The specialized pursuit team would still detect her passage. They were too skilled for complete evasion, but her techniques would slow their tracking progress significantly while she established greater separation. 3 hours of careful movement brought her to the edge of a steep ravine as full darkness settled over the wilderness. The natural feature presented both challenge and opportunity, difficult to navigate safely, especially in darkness, but offering protection from flanking maneuvers and creating a natural channel that would force pursuers into predictable approach vectors. Rebecca secured her equipment for the descent, then navigated the ravine's steep wall with methodical precision. The loose shale and limited handholds would have deterred most pursuers, but her mountaineering training provided techniques for safe descent even in these challenging conditions. Reaching the ravine floor, Rebecca paused to gather environmental data, the sound of water indicating a stream nearby, the subtle shift in air temperature suggesting the ravine opened into a larger valley system within a mile of her position, the absence of wildlife sounds in one direction, pointing to possible human presence disrupting natural patterns. She oriented toward the apparent valley system, moving alongside the stream rather than in it. Water movement would eventually erase any signs of passage, but immediate pursuit would easily detect disturbances in the streambed itself. The ravine gradually widened, transitioning into a broader valley bordered by steep slopes. The terrain offered increased movement options, but also reduced cover from aerial surveillance if it resumed at first light. Rebecca needed to establish a defensible position before dawn, preferably one that provided both concealment and observation advantages. As she evaluated potential locations, an unexpected sound reached her heightened senses, the subtle, mechanical click of a weapon being readied for firing approximately 70 yards ahead in the darkness. Rebecca froze in mid-step, every sense immediately focusing on the potential threat. The sound had been too controlled for an inexperienced operator, suggesting she faced a professionally staged ambush rather than an accidental encounter. The pursuing teams had predicted her route with unsettling accuracy, positioning an intercept team directly in her path. Their discipline was impressive. No communication, minimal movement, perfect concealment that she would have walked directly into if not for that single small sound. But that tiny error would prove catastrophic for their operation. Now aware of the ambush, Rebecca assessed her options with cold precision. Direct confrontation against unknown numbers with unknown firepower would be unnecessarily risky. Retreat would potentially channel her into the main pursuit force following her trail. Lateral movement might trigger the ambush prematurely if detection equipment registered her heat signature changing direction. She chose the fourth option, one that only Artemis would consider viable. Moving with glacial slowness to prevent detection, Rebecca eased into a prone position behind a fallen log, then extracted specialized equipment from her pack. Unlike the electronic countermeasures most modern operators relied upon, her tools were primitive but devastatingly effective in the right hands. Small projectile devices containing concentrated animal scent attractants used by hunters. With expert precision, she launched these devices to strategic locations around the ambush position, creating a dispersed scent pattern that would draw immediate attention from the large predator whose territory markers she'd identified earlier. In her movement through the valley, the mountain lion would likely avoid direct confrontation with humans, but its territorial investigation would disrupt the ambush team's discipline and potentially reveal their positions as they responded to the unexpected presence of a major predator. Rebecca settled into absolute stillness, controlling her breathing and minimizing her heat signature by covering exposed skin. The ambush team's confidence in their technology would work against them. They would expect thermal imaging to detect any attempt to circumvent their position, not realizing their quarry had dissolved into the environmental background completely. Within minutes, the wildlife disruption she'd anticipated began, small animals reacting to the introduced scent markers, creating a wave of movement and sound that approached the ambush position from multiple directions. The psychological impact on waiting operators would be subtle but significant. The unnatural wildlife behavior triggering subconscious alerts even in the most disciplined personnel. The mountain lion announced its presence with a territorial vocalization that shattered the night's silence. a chilling scream that carried across the valley and immediately disrupted the ambush team's composure. Through her night vision, Rebecca observed their disciplined formation deteriorate as they responded to the unexpected threat. Communications suddenly active, positions shifting defensively, their tactical cohesion compromised. The ambush team revealed both their numbers, 4 operators, and their positions as they adjusted to the wildlife threat. Rebecca mapped their location and equipment in her mind, identifying the team leader by his communication pattern and the probable escape routes they would utilize if their position became untenable. The mountain lion's territorial investigation continued, drawing inexorably closer to the hidden operators as it followed the artificial scent trail Rebecca had created. The team's discipline frayed further as the predator's proximity triggered primal human responses to potential danger. When the first operator broke position, activating his tactical light to scan for the approaching predator, the ambush was effectively neutralized. Rebecca seized the opportunity, utilizing their distraction to circumvent their position completely, while gathering valuable intelligence about their equipment, tactics, and weaknesses. The ease with which she defeated a professionally staged ambush without firing a shot or revealing her position demonstrated the gulf between standard tactical training, even at elite levels, and the specialized skills that had made Artemis legendary among tracking units. These men hunted humans with technology and training. Artemis hunted with an intimate understanding of the natural world that no equipment could replicate, the ability to turn the environment itself against her pursuers. As she established safe distance from the compromised ambush team, Rebecca allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. The specialized pursuit force had been deployed with exceptional resources and tactical advantages, yet she'd consistently outmaneuvered them using fundamentals they'd overlooked in their reliance on technology. The rally point lay just 8 miles ahead, challenging terrain but navigable before dawn if she maintained steady progress. Colonel Hargrove's extraction team would provide the resources and security needed to properly analyze the intelligence she'd gathered and formulate a strategy for locating Zakarian in his new identity. Rebecca adjusted her course toward the coordinates, moving with renewed purpose through the wilderness. The pursuit teams had revealed critical information about their capabilities and command structure, information that would prove valuable in the wider conflict to come. They had come hunting. Artemis, bringing their most advanced technology and specialized personnel, they had found her. And now they understood why those who hunted Artemis rarely lived to describe the experience. We'll handle the processing through secure protocols, Hargrove told her quietly as Prescott was led away. The evidence is overwhelming, both his original identity and his recent orders regarding civilian elimination. He won't escape accountability this time. Rebecca nodded, the culmination of her hunt bringing not the satisfaction she'd anticipated, but rather a profound sense of completion. What about Clearwater Springs, Billy's family, the others who helped me? Already addressed, Hargrove assured her. Federal protection teams with proper authorization are securing the community against potential retaliation. Billy will be reunited with his family once the immediate security concerns are resolved. And me? Rebecca asked, already knowing the complex reality of her situation. Hargrove's expression conveyed understanding of her unspoken concerns. Rebecca Mitchell can't simply return to Willow Creek Ranch as if nothing happened. The exposure has been too significant, the official records too compromised. I know, she acknowledged. The peaceful life she'd built had been irreparably disrupted. The moment Blackwood's team had appeared in Clearwater Springs. What are my options? New identity, new location, full protective protocols, Hargrove outlined. Or, Rebecca caught the hesitation. Or official reinstatement under specialized parameters. Your skills remain exceptional, and there are operations that could benefit from them, strictly on a voluntary basis, with complete operational discretion and oversight protections that were absent during Shadowfall. The offer represented a path she hadn't considered, not a return to her former life, but an evolution that acknowledged both who she had been and who she had become. I need time, she decided, to process everything that's happened and determine what comes next. Hargrove nodded. Of course. In the meantime, we've established a secure location where you can decompress while the Prescott situation is contained. Whatever you decide, you've earned the right to choose your path forward. 3 months later, spring brought new growth to the remote Montana Valley, where Rebecca had established a temporary residence. The small cabin overlooking pristine wilderness offered both security and the natural environment that had become essential to her well-being. Sheriff Lawson's truck appeared on the access road, precisely on schedule for his monthly visit. The sheriff had become an important connection to her former community, bringing news of Clearwater Springs and updates on the people she'd left behind. Town's finally getting back to normal, Lawson reported as they shared coffee on the cabin's porch. Federal presence is completely withdrawn now that the Prescott situation has been resolved. How are the Hawkins family doing? Rebecca asked. Billy's something of a local hero, though nobody knows exactly why, Lawson smiled. His father says the boy's considering a career in law enforcement after his experience. Seems it gave him direction rather than scaring him off. Rebecca nodded, pleased that the young man had found positive meaning in the dangerous events he'd been drawn into. Wade Johnson asks about you whenever I see him, the sheriff continued. Says the replacement store manager at the general store doesn't keep inventory worth a damn. The mention brought an unexpected smile to Rebecca's face. The community connections she'd built during her years in Clearwater Springs had proven more meaningful than she'd realized while living there. And the ranch? She asked. Caretakers are maintaining it well enough, Lawson assured her, though the cattle miss you, according to Billy, who checks on them regularly. Rebecca gazed out at the wilderness beyond the porch, contemplating the decision she'd been approaching for weeks now. I've been considering my options, Tom. Figured you might be, the sheriff replied. Hargrove mentioned you had several when we spoke last month. She turned to study him with renewed attention. You've been in contact with Colonel Hargrove? Lawson shrugged slightly. Former Marines keep in touch, especially when they share concern for someone important to both of them. The revelation wasn't entirely surprising. Military connections often ran deeper than civilian relationships, creating networks that operated beneath official channels. I'm not returning to Willow Creek Ranch, Rebecca stated, having finally reached certainty on this point. That life was built with Michael. Trying to recapture it would honor neither his memory nor the person I've become through all this. Lawson nodded, accepting her decision without judgment. And the Colonel's other offer? Back to active operations? Not exactly, Rebecca replied. I've proposed an alternative arrangement, a specialized training program for tracking and wilderness operations, based out of a secure facility but conducting field exercises in appropriate wilderness areas. The program would develop next-generation capabilities while allowing me to pass on skills that might otherwise be lost. Teaching rather than doing, Lawson summarized. A combination, Rebecca clarified. Operational consultation when absolutely necessary, but primarily focusing on developing others rather than direct field work. The sheriff considered this, understanding the balance she was seeking. Sounds like you're finding a middle path between Artemis and Rebecca Mitchell. I'm integrating them, she corrected gently. I've realized they were never truly separate identities, just different expressions of the same person. The tracker who hunts threats and the woman who built a home in Clearwater Springs both exist within me. Lawson nodded, comprehension evident in his weathered features. For what it's worth, I think it's the right choice. Your skills are too valuable to lose, but you've earned more than a return to the shadows. Rebecca appreciated his understanding. The path forward wouldn't be simple, but it represented authentic integration rather than compartmentalization of her capabilities and experiences. "There's one more thing," she said, reaching for an envelope she'd prepared before his arrival. "For the Hawkins family. A proper thank you for Billy's help when it mattered most." Lawson accepted the envelope, recognition dawning as he felt the weight and shape of its contents. "The deed to Willow Creek Ranch?" Rebecca nodded. "They've wanted to expand their operation for years, but couldn't afford additional property. The ranch should go to people who'll care for it properly and understand its value beyond mere acreage." "That's a substantial gift," the sheriff observed. "It's appropriate." "Compensation," Rebecca replied. "Without Billy's help that day, things might have ended very differently." As Lawson departed with promises to deliver the deed and return the following month, Rebecca remained on the porch, watching the evening light transform the mountain landscape. The wilderness before her represented both challenge and sanctuary. The environment that had shaped Artemis and provided healing for Rebecca Mitchell. Her future would embrace both aspects of her nature, the hunter and the nurturer, the tracker and the teacher. The skills that had made her exceptional would now serve to develop others, while maintaining connection to the natural world that had always been her truest element. In the distance, a lone wolf appeared at the forest edge, studying her with the intelligent assessment characteristic of apex predators. Rebecca met its gaze with quiet acknowledgement, one hunter recognizing another across the species divide. The wolf turned unhurriedly, disappearing into the gathering dusk with fluid grace. Rebecca smiled, understanding the symmetry of the moment. Like the wolf, she would always maintain her essential nature while adapting to changing circumstances. The hunter would remain, transformed but not diminished, integrated into the woman, who had found purpose beyond the kill. Artemis lived on, not as a weapon but as a guardian, and in Montana's wilderness, guardians found both purpose and peace. The advanced tracking facility nestled in Wyoming's Medicine Bow Mountains resembled a high-end wilderness retreat more than a government training installation. Deliberately designed to blend with its natural surroundings, the complex utilized sustainable materials and innovative camouflage techniques that made it nearly invisible from both ground and aerial approaches. Rebecca surveyed the main training field, where 12 candidates executed specialized tracking exercises under the watchful eyes of instructors she'd personally selected and trained. These weren't typical military recruits, but carefully chosen individuals with exceptional aptitude for the unique skill set Rebecca sought to preserve and advance. "The Yang sisters are outperforming everyone again," observed Marcus Rivera, a former Force Recon Marine who served as Rebecca's chief instructor. "Their wilderness awareness is practically supernatural." Rebecca nodded, watching the twin women navigate a complex tracking scenario with fluid coordination that required minimal verbal communication. They grew up in the Alaskan bush with a grandfather who taught traditional hunting methods. Technology isn't their primary tool, it's supplementary to what they already know. "Like someone else I know," Marcus replied with knowing respect. The training program, officially designated Advanced Environmental Recognition and Tracking Engagement Methodologies, Artemis, represented Rebecca's vision for integrating traditional tracking techniques with modern technology. Unlike conventional military training that increasingly relied on electronic surveillance and data interpretation, Rebecca's approach emphasizes developing the human senses first, then enhancing them with appropriate technology. Colonel Hargrove's arriving for the quarterly review, Marcus informed her, checking his secure communications device. ETA 20 minutes at the South Landing Zone. Rebecca acknowledged the information with a nod. I'll meet him there. Take over observation of the field exercise. She walked the perimeter trail that connected the facility's components, passing the indoor training centers, operational planning buildings, and specialized equipment development labs. The complex represented a significant investment by specific government agencies that had recognized the value of Rebecca's unique capabilities and methodologies. The landing zone occupied a natural clearing, reinforced with specialized materials that minimize environmental impact while providing secure access for authorized aircraft. As Rebecca arrived, the distinctive sound of a helicopter approached from the south, the specially modified transport that Colonel Hargrove utilized for his inspection visits. James Hargrove had aged visibly during the past year, the strain of navigating bureaucratic battles to establish and maintain Rebecca's program taking a physical toll. Yet his military bearing remained impeccable as he descended from the aircraft, acknowledging Rebecca with the professional respect that had characterized their relationship since her active service days. The program looks exceptional, he noted, after they'd exchanged greetings. Aerial approach shows minimal environmental disruption and near-perfect concealment metrics. We're implementing the living camouflage techniques developed last quarter, Rebecca explained as they walked toward the main facility. Natural vegetation integration with structural elements reduces thermal signature by 60% compared to conventional methods. Hargrove nodded approval. Impressive, though I'd expect nothing less. How are the candidates progressing? Third cohort is outperforming previous groups by measurable margins. The selection criteria refinements are yielding better baseline capabilities. They entered the main administrative building, proceeding to Rebecca's office, a space that reflected her dual nature through its combination of advanced technology and natural elements. One wall displayed digital mapping and candidate performance metrics, while another featured wilderness photography and traditional tracking implements from various cultures. The Oversight Committee has completed its annual review, Hargrove informed her, accepting the coffee she offered. Program funding secured for 3 additional years, with expanded parameters for international cooperation on selected training modules. The news represented significant validation for Rebecca's vision, transitioning from proof of concept to established program with long-term institutional support. And the other matter? She inquired, knowing Hargrove would understand. Her reference, the Colonel's expression tightened slightly. Prescott's trial proceeds through classified channels, evidence deemed conclusive by the tribunal, sentencing expected within 30 days. Rebecca absorbed this information with the measured detachment she'd cultivated regarding Zakarian Prescott's fate. Justice had been her objective, not vengeance, though the distinction sometimes blurred when she allowed herself to remember Michael's final days. His network, she asked, partially dismantled. Key financial structures frozen, operational, assets identified and contained. But as you anticipated, the interest behind him proved extensive and deeply embedded. Some elements have already been reconstituted under different management. They always do, Rebecca acknowledged, realistic about the persistent nature of such power structures. Have they made any attempts regarding our program? Hargrove's slight smile contained grim satisfaction. 2 infiltration attempts during the selection phase for Cohort 3, both identified and redirected through the countermeasures you designed. The applicants never realized they were being evaluated on their susceptibility to external influence. Rebecca nodded, pleased the security protocols had functioned as intended. The program's value made it an inevitable target for those who preferred certain tracking capabilities to remain limited to their own specialized units. "There's something else," Hargrove continued, his tone shifting subtly, personal rather than operational. Rebecca gave him her full attention, recognizing the rare departure from their typically professional interactions. "Sheriff Lawson contacted me through our established channel. The Hawkins family has completed renovation of the main house at Willow Creek Ranch. They're hosting a community gathering next month to formally thank you for the property transfer." The information stirred unexpected emotion. Rebecca had deliberately maintained distance from Clearwater Springs while establishing the training program, though Sheriff Lawson's regular updates kept her connected to the community she'd once called home. "Their intention," Hargrove continued carefully, "is to dedicate the renovated property as a veterans retreat center, a place where former operators can decompress and reintegrate in a supportive environment. They're hoping you might attend the dedication." Rebecca moved to the office window, gazing at the training grounds where future trackers developed skills that had once been her exclusive domain. The symmetry of the Hawkins family's intention wasn't lost on her, creating a healing space from the property where she'd sought her own recovery after military service. "What's your assessment?" she asked Hargrove, valuing his tactical perspective even on personal matters. "Security parameters are manageable. The program's operational integrity wouldn't be compromised by your brief absence. And," he hesitated, before adding, "there may be psychological value in formal closure with that chapter of your life." Rebecca considered the observation, recognizing its validity. While she'd integrated the various aspects of her identity into her current role, she hadn't fully reconciled with the community that had sheltered her during her years as simply Rebecca Mitchell. "I'll consider it," she decided. "Thank you for conveying the message." Their discussion turned to operational matters, training protocols, equipment requisitions, intelligence sharing parameters with allied programs. Yet the possibility of returning to Clearwater Springs lingered in Rebecca's thoughts, representing unfinished business in her otherwise methodical approach to life's transitions. Later that evening, after Hargrove's departure and the completion of daily training evaluations, Rebecca retreated to her private cabin at the facility's edge. Unlike the main complex, with its sophisticated systems and continuous activity, her personal space reflected the simplicity she'd valued at Willow Creek Ranch: natural materials, minimal technology, and expansive views of the wilderness beyond. She reviewed Sheriff Lawson's formal invitation, delivered via secure courier rather than electronic means, a thoughtful acknowledgement of her preference for tangible communication when possible. The Hawkins family had included a handwritten note expressing their gratitude and describing how Michael's medical equipment, preserved in the ranch house, had inspired their vision for a healing center focused on veterans with similar specializations. CY connection to Michael felt significant, a continuation of his compassionate nature through others who had never met him but understood his legacy through the ranch he'd loved. Perhaps attending the dedication would honor his memory more effectively than her continued absence from the community they'd chosen together. Rebecca moved to a locked cabinet that contained her few personal mementos, retrieving the photograph she'd taken from the storm cellar during her escape from Willow Creek Ranch. The image of Tracker Unit 7, her original team, including Michael, remained her most tangible connection to her husband beyond the wedding band she still wore on a chain around her neck. She studied Michael's face in the photograph, remembering his unwavering belief that they could build a life beyond operations, beyond the shadow world they'd inhabited for so many years. He had seen the possibility of peace for them both, when she had seen only the next mission, the next target, the next deployment. "You were right about Clearwater Springs," she told him quietly. It was the right place for us, just not for the time we expected. The decision formed with characteristic clarity. She would attend the dedication ceremony, not as Artemis, returning triumphantly after completing her mission, but as Rebecca Mitchell, acknowledging the community that had embraced her during her years among them. The next morning, Rebecca summoned Marcus Rivera and her other lead instructors to outline operational adjustments required for her brief absence. The team had developed sufficient autonomy to maintain program integrity during short leadership transitions, another measure of the program's successful institutionalization. "This is a personal matter?" Rivera asked, after she'd outlined the timing and security parameters. "Yes," Rebecca confirmed, her tone indicating further explanation would not be forthcoming. Rivera nodded with immediate understanding. Despite their close professional relationship, certain boundaries remained firmly established. "We'll manage primary operations and maintain standard security protocols. The candidate evaluation schedule will proceed as established." The efficiency with which her team adapted to her planned absence reinforced Rebecca's confidence in the program's sustainability. Unlike traditional military structures built around personality-driven leadership, she had deliberately designed Artemis with distributed expertise and overlapping capabilities, no single point of failure, including herself. 2 weeks later, Rebecca approached Clearwater Springs from the northwest, deliberately avoiding the main highway access routes. The unmarked vehicle, provided by Hargrove's security team, offered both anonymity and defensive capabilities if needed, though intelligence indicated no remaining surveillance of the area following Prescott's containment. The landscape stirred, memories with each familiar landmark: the rolling hills, where she'd conducted early morning rides, the stream crossings she'd improved for cattle movement, the rocky outcroppings that had provided observation points during her confrontation. With Blackwood's team, Willow Creek Ranch appeared transformed as she created the final ridge. New outbuildings complemented the original structures, and the main house gleamed with fresh paint and expanded features that maintained its architectural character while enhancing its functionality. Vehicles lined the approach road, indicating substantial community attendance at the dedication ceremony. Rebecca parked at the designated visitor area, momentarily hesitant before emerging into public view for the first time since leaving Clearwater Springs over a year ago. Her appearance had been subtly altered. Hairstyle changed, subtle cosmetic modifications to facial structure, clothing distinctly different from her former rancher aesthetic. Not disguised precisely, but adjusted to reduce immediate recognition. By casual acquaintances, Sheriff Lawson awaited her at the edge of the gathering, alerted by security protocols established during their planning communications. His weathered face registered pleasure at her arrival, tempered with professional assessment of her well-being. "Wasn't entirely sure you'd come," he acknowledged, as they walked toward the ceremony area established near the aspen grove, where Michael was buried. "Neither was I," Rebecca admitted, "until recently." "The Hawkins family has done right by the place," Lawson observed. "Maintained its character while adapting it for the new purpose. Think you'll find they've honored the spirit of what you and Michael built here." The ceremony area came into view, revealing nearly 100 people gathered on chairs arranged before a simple podium. Rebecca recognized many faces from her years in Clearwater Springs. Wade Johnson from the general store, Dr. Wilson from the medical clinic, neighboring ranchers and townspeople who had accepted her as one of their own without knowing her complete history. Billy Hawkins stood with his family near the podium, his posture reflecting new confidence and maturity beyond his years. The experience of helping Rebecca during the crisis had apparently accelerated his development from teenager to young man with purpose. Rebecca positioned herself at the gathering's edge, close enough to observe, but removed enough to maintain space if needed. Sheriff Lawson remained nearby, a protective presence honoring their long-standing arrangement. The ceremony progressed with the straightforward dignity characteristic of rural Montana communities. Acknowledgements without excessive formality, gratitude expressed without dramatic flourish. Practical details of the center's operation outlined for community awareness. When Billy Hawkins approached the podium, Rebecca focused her complete attention on the young man who had risked himself to help her escape the federal containment operation. "Most of you know that our family received this ranch as a gift," he began, his voice stronger and more assured than she remembered. "What many don't know is why we decided to create this veterans center rather than simply expanding our cattle operation." He paused, scanning the audience before continuing. "During the unusual events last year, I had the privilege of helping someone who had served our country in ways most of us will never fully understand. That experience showed me how those who protect us carry burdens long after their official service ends." Rebecca felt an unexpected emotional rise as Billy described his vision for the center, a place where those who had operated in classified environments could find understanding and acceptance during their transition to civilian life. The concept aligned perfectly with Michael's original intention for the property as a healing space after their own operational careers. "While the previous owner couldn't be here officially today," Billy concluded, his gaze sweeping the audience, and briefly connecting with Rebecca despite her position at the gathering's edge, "we believe this dedication honors both her gift and her husband's memory by continuing their commitment to helping others heal from experiences most civilians never witness." The ceremony concluded with a ribbon cutting at the main house entrance, followed by community gathering with food and conversation. Rebecca remained at the perimeter, observing rather than participating until Billy Hawkins approached her location with deliberate casualness that suggested Sheriff Lawson had directed him. "Wasn't sure you'd actually come," the young man said, echoing Lawson's earlier observation. "Your invitation was compelling," Rebecca replied, studying the changes in him since their last interaction. "The center is an excellent concept." Billy nodded, a trace of his former youthful uncertainty briefly visible beneath his new confidence. Found some of Dr. Mitchell's medical journals in the house storage, his notes about treating veterans with certain types of experiences. It seemed like the property was always meant for something like this. The revelation that Michael's professional documentation had inspired the center's purpose struck Rebecca deeply. Even in death, her husband's compassion continued to create healing opportunities for others. "He would have approved completely," she assured Billy. "It's exactly the kind of legacy he would have wanted." The young man studied her with unexpected perceptiveness. "And you? Have you found what you were looking for after everything that happened?" The question's directness might have seemed presumptuous from anyone else, but Billy had earned the right to ask through his actions during the crisis. "I've found integration," Rebecca answered after thoughtful consideration. "Not exactly peace, but purpose that honors both aspects of who I am." Billy seemed to understand the distinction, nodding with wisdom beyond his years. "Dad says sometimes the best we can do is make sure our ghosts walk beside us instead of behind us. Easier to keep an eye on them that way." The insight carried remarkable perception from a ranching family with no direct experience of classified operations or the psychological aftermath they often created. Yet they had intuitively grasped the essential challenge faced by those who served in shadow worlds. "Your father is a wise man," Rebecca acknowledged. "The center will help many people precisely because of that understanding." Their conversation concluded with Billy's return to his hosting responsibilities, leaving Rebecca to continue her observation of the community she had briefly called home. The gathering represented the life she might have lived if circumstances had been different. If Blackwood's team hadn't arrived, if Zakarian's new identity hadn't been threatened by her existence, if Michael had lived to continue building their shared vision. Yet she felt no regret for the path that had ultimately emerged. The Artemis program represented a different but equally valuable contribution, preserving and advancing skills that might otherwise be lost, preparing a new generation to protect others using capabilities that technology alone could never replicate. As the gathering began to disperse, Rebecca made her way to the aspen grove, where Michael's grave remained undisturbed, now incorporated into a meditation garden for the Veterans Center. The headstone had been professionally restored, the surrounding area enhanced with native plantings, and a simple bench positioned for quiet reflection. She placed her hand on the cool stone, feeling a connection to the man who had loved both Artemis the operative and Rebecca the woman, who had seen no contradiction between those aspects of her identity when she herself had struggled to reconcile them. "They're honoring your vision," she told him quietly. "Both here and in Wyoming, different expressions of the same purpose." The wind moved through the aspen leaves, creating the distinctive rustling sound that had always reminded Michael of whispered conversations. Rebecca smiled at the memory, feeling completion rather than renewed grief. The mission that had begun with her defense of Willow Creek Ranch had concluded not just with justice for those responsible for his death, but with continuation of his healing work through new channels. As she prepared to depart, Sheriff Lawson approached with a small package. "Wade Johnson asked me to give you this. Said you'd understand its significance." Rebecca opened the parcel to find a small container of the specialized tea Michael had favored, the blend she had purchased during her final visit to the General Store before Blackwood's arrival had disrupted her life completely. The thoughtful gesture represented perfect closure, acknowledgement of what had been lost combined with appreciation for what remained. Wade had recognized her at the ceremony despite her altered appearance, yet had respected her desire for limited interaction while still conveying personal connection. "Tell him thank you," she requested, "and that I appreciate everyone's discretion." "Today," Lawson nodded, understanding. "Community protects its own, even when they've moved on. Safe journey back to whatever you're building now." Rebecca departed as she had arrived, quietly, without ceremony, leaving minimal evidence of her presence. The visit had provided important resolution, confirming that her decision to transfer the property had been correct while establishing healthy boundaries between her former and current lives. As she drove away from Clearwater Springs for the final time, Rebecca felt the completion of a circle that had begun with her arrival as a grieving widow seeking anonymity and concluded with her departure as an integrated woman with clear purpose. The skills that had made her Artemis remained vital to national security through the program she'd established, while the humanity Michael had nurtured continued through both her current work and the Veterans Center that would bear his influence. The hunter had found her prey and delivered justice. The widow had honored her husband's memory through continued service to others. The tracker had established a legacy that would extend beyond her individual capabilities, and Rebecca Mitchell, containing all these aspects within one integrated identity, drove toward the mountains where new challenges and purpose awaited, at peace with her past and engaged with her future in equal measure. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.